Reed one day was like, why grow it if you can't eat it? What's the point? What's the point of like calla lilies and zinnias and stuff? I mean, if you can't eat it, who cares, right? So they're all about that. Mr. Satori, good to see you. I think it's really neat to give them an opportunity to say, you start here and it grows, and then you put it in the kitchen, and you can actually kind of it's much more participatory, which is very, very neat. So we enjoy it a lot. But everyone, Thomas Jockin Substack is freaking legendary. I have to highly suggest it as one of the most fantastic. I'm thinking about what I want to call it. Because when anyone asks me where to start philosophy, and we can talk about anything on this fine day, Michelle and I just had a talk on the ought of philosophy. Like, why ought you do philosophy? Because in a weird way, it feels like you shouldn't tell people they should do philosophy. So why do philosophy? What exactly is the imperative to do it? And we talked a little bit, because it's always fun to throw meta in front of a word, is that there's a kind of meta ought to it, which is you ought to be able to tell what you ought to do. Like, you ought to actually create the conditions where discerning what you ought to do is possible. And there's a weird way as well in which philosophy always kind of feels like, to me, it wants to assert it's important, but then also is hesitant to assert that it's important, because there's also something self-evident about that. And I'll give it to Daniel, and then again, we can talk about anything. Because it's like, well, duh, you ought to be able to tell what you ought to do. So why do I even need to tell you that? Why does that even need to be asserted? And yet it turns out that it's actually very, very difficult to meet the conditions to determine what you ought to do, or to be free. You know, that Jockin has pointed out that the problem is we're not naturally free, because we have ideas that kind of take us more than we have them. Like, we have ideas more than think ideas, and we're just kind of caught up at that secondhand spoke. But anyway, I just wanted to say, if anyone asks me where should I start philosophy, I'm going to send them to Jockin. That piece as just kind of the opening, I want to say framework, but that can be an overused word, just kind of giving you the arc of what exactly, how these pieces connected, by which then when you read Aristotle, you read Plato, you have a hook to hang your hat on. And I'm now also just thinking about like how well that just frames everything. So I'm basically just saying everyone read Mr. Jockin's work, because it's just a wonderful, yeah, it's just fantastic. I'm going to be sending people to it who ask, where should I start philosophy? And it kind of, I also in the belonging again think a lot about receptivity to the address. How do you make people receptive to the address that belonging again is talking about? And a lot of what Jockin is for me, in that kind of subjectivity of sainthood, is precisely the subject that is able to kind of receive the address, that I think, and all that has to be elaborated on. But I really enjoyed it, Mr. Jockin. But let me throw it to Daniel here, and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day. Daniel, please.
Just before I jumped on, I was watering the garden. We just put in grass. It's probably not a good timing, because winter's about to come. But I was fertilizing, and I'm very pleased that we're going to have a lawn again. We did a bit of an AstroTurf situation for a while, so I'm hoping the grass takes. I'm doing it now in the evening. I've always appreciated lawns. It's incredible. They're wonderful, just grass. Mowed grass. I often, okay, but let me get distracted by this, because I was also listening to this past week, in these little moments and like commuting and etc. and some house chores. I've been listening to Augustine's Confessions, and I had one of these this familiar experience of encountering. You know, like I knew Augustine existed. I knew obviously there were the Confessions, and I even had some thoughts about the Confessions and about Augustine, but I hadn't gone to the primary text. And so then going to the primary text, inevitably I'm encountering these ways in which the assumptions that I had, that I've picked up about it, they don't quite fit. And I mean, even studying philosophy now for 10 years, I keep needing to be reminded of this, like return, get back to the source material, and it's been speaking to people in new ways for thousands of years. It will probably speak to you in a new way. But I mean, maybe it's an inevitable process because you have to find a foothold somewhere, and then we develop this um what it could I think he called like a meta ontology or something. Like you kind of have to recapitulate to yourself some version of the philosophical historical conversation, and it's necessarily going to be like pretty low resolution. But if you have just keep growing in that sense of the movement of the conversation, and certain thinkers and texts will really almost come to you at particular moments, and then you can dive into that study of them. And I mean, the best thing would to join people who are also gathered around those texts. But it's also something that I realize just very very small things or adjustments that have been given or suggested by others who have been engaging texts that have proven very useful in engaging the text, like little things that you pick up in conversation or that a professor will say in terms of how to engage this, or they actually end up really sticking with you and like yielding in your effort and in your reading. Like how do you read a text? One thing we were told is the first time you read it, just read it through. Don't worry about where you don't understand, just read it through. The second time, you can stop where your understanding is not tracking, and then you can maybe comb through a couple times again, but then don't get too bogged down, but notice those places where you aren't really understanding what's happening. And then on the third go, you now try and extract the argument that's being made in the text. So now it's like a very active reading, and you're trying to now draw out that structure from the text. And then only after that third time can you say like, okay, I've given it sufficient attention. I which is, I mean, just incredibly helpful. I'm tagging this because I wanted to contribute to this momentum of well, Jockin's essays, which I was just thinking about the essay that you did last year, Jock, on Aristotle's theory of memory and the heart. Well, I mean that the Lord of Perception, the heart. That's just a fantastic uh, this one of the things that it wasn't Augustine. It was more like Gurdjieff. Like, what is an impression? And the work of having something make an impression on you. There's like a little bit of extra effort that you have to give in order to be impressed by something. Like how do you train attention so that you can not just pass over objects and material that comes into your life, but what is that way in which you can attend to it such that it impresses you, or like your child is reporting their day. How do you engage such that you draw from them what impressed them about their day? The Lord of Perception as the heart probably has something to do with that. Then the last thing is just an appreciation and a thanks to you and Michelle, Daniel, in terms of your channel is definitely something that I appreciate and can share onto my own networks as this encouragement into philosophize your life. This focus that you've both had this year, it's incredibly helpful. So I appreciate you creating these resources, and it is this dilemma, because I almost want to say on top of your video, like, you must philosophize, but it's a bit strange. And then like I was thinking about the Socrates thing, and like it's more negative framing, like the unexamined life is not worth living. Like that's a very strong it's strong, but there's also something like it's not you must. But I think the direction that you took, Daniel, is very helpful in terms of like uh, is an ought or ought. Like you ought to. Okay, I'm forgetting exactly how you played with it, but oh man, it's really fantastic just to be here in conversation and philosophy. I mean, a real wow, it's just good.
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Daniel, and thank you very much for your kind words there. And yeah, that's kind of where the conversation come from. Michelle and we're kind of talking in the kitchen or at the booth, and it's like, so when we talk about philosophize your life, are we saying people ought to philosophize your life? Because if we're not saying they ought to, then what are we saying? So we are saying that, but then in a weird way, philosophy doesn't, in my opinion, well, if philosophy tells you exactly what you should do, it becomes that bad philosophy we talked about last week. That's the totalitarian, that lends itself in the direction of the totalitarianism that David Hume is so concerned about. So then a good philosophy is embedded in common life, but then that would mean that how one philosophizes is always can't be divided from their particular, their very specific embodied experience, common life, their particular relations, and how exactly, what would it mean to offer something to people in situations that you yourself cannot know what they're like because you're not in them yourself. And nevertheless, what is on offer is to some degree helpful, quote unquote. To some degree can unlock something, right? So that's kind of the weird space I think that Michelle and I, that, like when we talk about the meta ought, and again, it's always cool to throw meta in front of something. Like the meta ought of philosophy seems to be this dealing with this problem of, well, if we're not like there, then we don't know what we're talking about. But we're talking about something, and supposedly it has something of universal relevance to regardless of specifics. And so it's trying to tell people, it's trying to talk about what one ought to do in order to identify what they ought to do for themselves, almost. It's like a double ought on top. Like you need to meet certain conditions by which to discern, right? Like, so far as an example, if you only have, you ought to have the distinction. I'll just use that Isaiah Berlin distinction, although I think there's a third freedom, between negative freedom and positive freedom, freedom to and freedom from. If you do not have that, you're going to be less likely to identify different qualities of freedom, and this will probably lead to poor decision making or poor, life results, right? So you ought to know that distinction. But no, I'm not going to tell you what to do with that distinction, but you ought to know that distinction because it opens up the world, right? Like terms and language can open up the world, right? And so it's interesting to think about philosophy as this kind of meta ought, and I'll throw it to Jockin and Greg here. But the thing about you were just saying about going back to a book and being like, I think reading begins when you reread a book and realize you missed it entirely. Like that's almost when literacy begins in a certain sense. I'll never forget the moment of going back and reading a book I thought I read and being like, am I an idiot? Like, how stupid am I? Like, did I not even read this book? That is this. I'll use the human shaking out of the dogmatic slumber, as Kant said, of your literacy. Like you think you're literate, and then you're like, I can't read. I can't read. And it's almost like reading begins on the other side of that experience of encountering a book that you thought you knew and realizing you didn't know it at all, right? And that's but the key with that is almost by definition that requires rereading. Like that requires rereading something, revisiting something. I think this was perhaps a benefit of some, generally religious traditions can have a primary text that you may revisit every year or constantly, right? An advantage of that, just simply in terms of literacy, is that experience. Oh, you've read this parable 1,000 times. You thought what it meant. No, you missed that little detail. You missed that little detail. Oh, you missed the context. And you're like, oh my gosh. And I think absolutely that happened. I used to, it's everyone. There's also something weird where all the people I most disliked, now I was like, oh, they're really important. Like I hated Hume. I was like, oh, he's a stupid empiricist. And you're like, I completely misread him. And then you're like, I hate Hegel. It's like, oh, there's a lot here. And now I'm having this terrible experience with Deleuze. I'm like, gosh darn it, there's more here than I thought. And then the rude rhizome thing. And that's sort of, but then I guess also the value is just for me a heuristic. I take that anxiety of influence stuff seriously, where Harold Bloom is like the people the writers that people most dislike, they tend to be the most liked, right? Or there's actually the most kind of there's an anxiety of influence. I think as a good key, sometimes the writers of books you experience as the most kind of get out of my way, I don't like it, can actually be the place that leaning into can be the most productive. Now it depends. I don't want to say that as a universal law, but that can sometimes be the case. But let me pause and throw it to Jockin and then Greg. Mr. Jockin, please.
Obviously, Daniel, thank you for the kind notes. I do appreciate it. It's always frustrating. Well, I very much appreciate it. I'm always frustrated in my right because there's always things missing. It's always feel like argument required a certain editing process, so there are things that had to get jettisoned out that I think are important. But nevertheless, thank you though. I do appreciate the note about it. But so the tie into that, what Dark Daniel's talking about, because I'm reminded of like wait how to read. I think it was Adler who wrote that book. Um, so the idea of like first reading, then what you're captivated by, then drawing out the argument. Um, I think very importantly, another aspect is related to memory, related to reading. I say this because when you're reading something, and I always find this is always for me one of the examples of like I'm just not convinced by just the recollection model of memory, meaning it's just like a thing on command that we can just will, right, and draw from ourselves. That does happen. I'm not denying that reality. That does happen, but I'm not saying I don't think that's exhaustive. Because in the reading experience, when you're deeply like in this idea of impression, like this mode of impression, when we are deeply impressed into a discipline, into a training and reading, we recall other things. Like we have memory of other things. Like we're reading, like, oh, this reminds me of, and then your memory is kicking in. Like, oh, this reminds me of this text, and then this was said. And then there are times where you do have that kind of vague, that even that very horrible feeling of like, what is this thing? I know this. You have this vague memory, and a lot of times it's a mismemory sometimes, but you have to go hunt it down. This is why note taking is so important. You got to go dig your notes out to find out where was this thing I said, or I remember someone wrote about this as similar something I read in Confessions is similar to what I saw from either from like an example, like I read Confessions too, and I had an experience like, oh right, this is where Thomas Aquinas got this. Or actually very recently, I just recently been down a train ride of reading Schopenhauer's Metaphysics of Love, and then recently The Gay Signs from Nietzsche. And I'm like, it's so much fun the recollectional quality of like, I mean that in a sense of like, oh right, that's where Nietzsche got it. All right, oh right, that's where Thomas got it. You can see the kind of the almost genealogy of thought that got carried over. Right, that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect, when you recall other texts or you have other associate, like again, it's the free associational aspect of it that the human person can do, and only the human person can do. Like the fact that I read, shall I say, I'm trying to think. Oh, like for example, like the idea of freedom. For example, like freedom is actually talking Nicomachean ethics in a very different relationship than what Plato talks about it in The Statesman, for example. Right? Those free associations, like where do they come from? They were just in me because I read those texts at some point. But why come up at this time and place? Like, um, I find memory just this very captivating mystery, because it's almost the mechanisms of actual of operations of memory certainly can be discussed from a neurological perspective, a neuroscience perspective. Um, but the question of why this memory at this time is deeply of an intimacy and a memory of a kind of almost I would say I have to say kind of love, right? I don't want to be kind of weirdly abstract with that framing, but I mean that in a sense of like when you're deeply in a discipline, that's what happens, right? You're just instantly going to you just instantly recall you draw that to these associations within an account that is coherent and it actually draws motivation, right? Because you get, oh right, and then you start looking into things. I'm doing that now as we're talking, like, oh right, what? And actually, a lot of times what I'm doing nowadays, it's a lot of times I'm like, what's the Greek term for this? And then where did I read this Greek term? And so actually language and names have very important powers. Um, Based on which name you use, it draws out different relationships and different signification. Um, I think those things are really interesting. And in fact, Dark Daniel went down that line of like my notion from Aristotle of the heart as the origin, as the lord of perception. And he went down a line of thought with that as a good example of that too. Um, I think those are really important. But I think actually what you're talking about is that foothold and the meta ought. I just think I'm just completely convinced in the argument that I don't buy how can the social, moral, emotional, like superstructures of society have fallen apart. They're a complete mess. At best, we have, shall I say, a kind of dark age as kind of nihilistic, like kind of shrug or groan or whimper about it. Like at best, um, it's almost like the thematic has been completely crushed out, like completely just stomped out completely. And generally, oh God, I was supposed to do an interview recently, or not a lecture, of Owen of the Aragon. I forgot his name. I apologize. I saw one of his lectures online, and he was talking about this. That basically the social moral state, basically his job is suppression of thumos. That's his job by pharmaceuticals or by psychology or psychological talk. One of the pathologizing of thumos. So we have nowhere to that energy to go. It gets compressed, suppressed, and it explode. Basically, it's going to get hidden away, and it's going to explode somewhere else. All I'm saying is the superstructures that contained all this and mediated it are all falling apart. They're all just not there. So as a result, I'm almost like, if you want to have any motion of a healthy relation, like that's why I had a whole lecture series on health on this exact point. I was very interested in this because the metaphysics of what is health is actually not a given, and we don't really have an intelligibility to talk about it. In fact, when we do talk about it, we talk about it as a quantity. We're just obsessed by a quantity and the images of the quantity. That's all we get caught up in. We don't actually know what it is. We just get which is I find it's this philosophy. One of philosophy's best jobs is the suspicion of the images. It's the suspicion of abstraction. It's actually very ironic because philosophy is so built. It's completely built on abstractions. Yet in reality, ultimately, it becomes super suspicious about it, and it's meant to give you a pause. That, oh, wait a minute, maybe this thing was just wait a minute, this whole thing is actually wrong, or maybe this account was actually false. And especially, and this is why my opinion in terms of the orientation of beauty first is because of that demand of the particularity, that the abstraction, its great danger is to make you run away, right? It makes you run away from what's actually in front of you because you think that real truth is that essence that's out there, right? Not the thing right in front of you, not before the eyes, or let alone what's in touch, right? So I find what is the meta art of philosophy is when the superstructures of orienting your life are basically falling apart. If you want to have any kind of health in terms of preservation of entity to exist, because things like self-exit, right, or drug abuse, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, addiction, like we have so many pathologies that are in a state of like great abundance. I always find that part the most curious about all of this is that in a state of absolute abundance, like materially, the inequality is there, but if we look at the absolute quality of poverty, it's orders of it's absurd what we have in almost all of the world. Even the most poor of the poor of the world now has a level of abundance that's incomprehensible in the past civilizations, and yet not even as a first, like we'll talk about first world because you guys have talked about this. Yet we're still dying, and we're dying by unnatural causes. I just find that there's a great contradiction in that. Something's going on there that just it doesn't make sense. If the game is simply we can just min-max our way to abundance and we're going to be all happy, that clearly has failed. And the social post-war order that oriented the moral structure of that is all falling apart. So then what's keeping us together? We need to think. We need philosophy. That's why we need it. And I just think as someone who, let alone just on a personal level, like I think things, like friendship, like how do you have, I find, again, it's a great question of, even Nietzsche talks about friendship, right? This is not, philosophers always known, the real ones all know friendship's where you have to end up in this discussion. Like you have to end up there because ultimately the question of friendship is the question of the self, right? The relationship is super important and very deeply related. Without these things considered, I don't know how you just basically it's survivalship, let alone thrive. And that's the thing too, let alone having a thriving state. Survivalship seems to be the issue. Okay, this is very long-winded to say. Like personally, what's going on right now is, and I talk about this because as the beauty guy, and all about demand of the receptivity of the particularity of this moment right in front of you. In my professional, in my education side, I have to do a lot of projectional planning right now, like in the sense of we're doing next year, and it's very interesting because it requires this abstract, like everyone in my group is incredibly execution mechanics based, but no one's doing the pause to step back and ask the question, what is the value proposition? What is what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? Like, yeah, we're doing output, but why are we doing this output? What is the end of what we're doing here? And what is and it's very interesting if you notice in contemporary thought, it's so much fracturing. Like everything's super scattered and becomes mechanics of particularity, and it's very compartmentalized, right? But there's no sense of unity to kind of step back and go, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why are we doing these things? And all of them have KPIs and all of them have metrics, but yet what is the unity of all this? Like what is the one that gives us all, right? Like that kind of line of thought. The way I have to answer this question as an educator is to ask the question, and actually, because we have these things, like I'll summarize the note. It's basically, for example, everyone's panicking about like, okay, we got to make sure our events on the calendar, like all the performances and the exhibitions, great. But we also have problems like students aren't taking the elective art classes, for example. Students aren't attending the events. Students aren't declaring the major, right? And the thing is, here's the question: are they discrete problems or are they related? These are the kind of questions that philosophy is supposed to answer this, or can actually help you answer, right? Because we have to think about the relationships. What do they all relate to? What is, quite frankly, from a sales perspective, what is the transformation? What is the subjectivity we're trying to generate in these students, for example? And how does that connect to them attending events? How does that connect to them attending classes? How does it intend them to connect to them majoring? And there's a way to do it, but you have to think through it. And this, I don't want to go into the details on the strategy, but that's the point. Look how much abstraction has to occur, and then how much, actually the very key note I will say, and I talked to Daniel privately about this, and I'll stop talking after this, because now I'm just kind of riffing on points, is lack. I think lack is a very important hermeneutic in these kind of questions. Because in lack, there's an interplay of what's the constraints, what's the limits, what is desire, what is being desired, what is blocking that desire, what is the transformation, and what is the receptivity that allows one to allow participation transformation, right? With a probabilistical stance, because you can't, it cannot be guaranteed it happens, but you can certainly enable it at higher probabilities, right? So I actually apply everything we've been talking about in this group for 5 years in the educational space. But I will comment, this is an incredible amount of abstraction. Michelle gave me a thumbs up. I'm like, off camera, that's funny. But the thing is, you gotta be it's like you constantly need to remember the pause. Remember the pause. And remember, these powers abstractions are very, very powerful, but they get caught up on it. And it's and measurement and quantity, they're all there, right? But that's second. It's always, those are there, but they're second. And you need them, but they're second. The question at hand is, what is the beautiful? What are we aiming towards? I mean, this is my line of thinking. What is the lacking quality receptivity for these students that we can engender, right? So thus you take this great manifold, which does exist, is the reality, the all different systems with different priorities and intentions. And then how do you hold them together into a dance, right? Basically, a kind of synchronicity dance that allows them into a what one action can have synchronistically 4 effects at the same time, right? This kind of stuff I'm thinking about. So I use philosophy all the time to think about these kind of things. It's really freaking hard. My brain hurts sometimes, but it's really fun, really interesting. So I think that's the kind of stuff like, why is philosophy interesting, or why is it a powerful thing? It's like this power of abstraction. But the power of abstraction you can run away from if you don't have a training in the beautiful to pause. And I'll stop with that.
No, absolutely magnificent. And I think, well, for Peter Berger, as you lose the mediating structures of society, third spaces, givens, et cetera, so forth, then we all become existentialists. And if you're an existentialist, you require philosophy to mediate the difference, and you require abstraction. But of course, this is energetically demanding and very, very difficult. And of course, if you're in philosophy, you could do the bad philosophy that David Hume warns destroys everything, leads to totalitarianism, dialectics of enlightenment. So you have to get to the good philosophy. Well, how do you do that? How do you embed it back in common life? How do you do that? And I think that there's a lot that's extremely important. I think what you were also saying, in Christian, wonderful to see you, sir. I think what you were saying on poverty and enrichment makes me think of Durkheim on suicide, his book. And it's very interesting as well because, there are some people that argue that poverty in first world nations can actually be worse because there's no social capital. They don't have communities. At least in other societies that might have more poverty, there tends to be more community and more society, right? So it depends. And what we have is we don't know how indeed to engage in the neoliberalism that leads to enrichment that doesn't backfire into a loss of the ability to mediate ourselves socially. And look, for Fukuyama, and I think it is tied to Themos, as you were talking about, but I think what you're saying is also to the reality that if abundance is not defined with beauty, then we have a problem. Like it can't take you where you need it to take you. Abundance becomes simply material that lacks a relation with it, of which is able to generate that of which we need to not give in to various forms of despair. So I think that's extremely important. And I think when we look at Durkheim, the sociologist, like history of poverty in different sort of societies, you see this this missing piece. And I think also all the more reason for you need to give your Substack to your committee, to the people you work with. That will be very important. But I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll throw it to Greg and anyone else who wants to speak today. I think this guy, I've been reading a lot on the Themos, and you mentioned Owen in the Agon. He does wonderful work with that. This question is tied to Themos. Because, Francis Fukuyama, quite famously in his book on the end of history is like, yeah, we're going to have to give up the Themos because Themos calls World War II, it calls conflict, and we're going to mediate it through capitalist competition and status and recognition and so on and so forth. Sloterdijk has a very interesting book called Rage Against Time, where he's trying to defend Themos as being necessary for, it's basically an energy that brings with it a whole lot of human potential. And his argument is that basically the mechanisms of managing it under capitalism are not sufficient. People do not feel recognized. They don't, and the recognition tends to get monopolized and so on and so forth. So you need a way to do something difficult, quote unquote, that's demanding of you, that can lead to recognition that doesn't create zero-sumness, where you get recognition by dominating other people, right? Because the most gets tied to recognition very much, right? Well, I think an experience of beauty is feeling recognized. When you experience the beautiful, you experience recognition. Furthermore, I have been thinking, to allude to Greg's very important work, if I use the metaphor that Greg uses in his book, and again, he can correct me on any of the details I get incorrect, on this idea of braiding the modern and the postmodern. Like there's something about the social today where I think you do have to braid these things together, or you end up in that nihilism you were describing, Jockin. You end up on that side. You have to braid them. And if you braid them, then there's a defense of interiority, as Greg emphasizes. I feel like that defense of interiority addresses Themos, because it is actually then in that experience of the emotional interiority, you feel this thing that is real. Like, you can't doubt the fact that you're having this experience of interiority that is recognized and can be recognized and can be shared. And that deals with the thematic. That creates a feeling of recognition and something social, and it takes work to do it. It's not easy to do it. It's hard to do it. But actually, like doing it creates, it has that bit of the challenge that I think Sloterdijk is talking about that we need. And I think it also opens you up. It makes you the kind of subject that can encounter the beautiful and the social. So it's interesting. I've been thinking, Greg, I've been thinking your work with Sloterdijk a bit and what he's talking about the most. And I find it very, very interesting because he's basically like, yeah, if we don't figure out what to do with the most, popularism's coming back, politics is going to fall apart. He wrote this a while ago, just like many of the sociologists were warning the same thing. It's like, you have to honor, they didn't use this language, but they're like, you have to honor Themos. You have to honor interiority. You have to honor people's cultural story. You have to honor these things or they get mad. And when they get mad, stuff doesn't go well. And the question is simply, how do you do it? And I think that's a lot of our question today. But I'll throw it to Greg and anyone who wants to speak on this fine day. Greg, thank you for being here.
Hi. Hi, Michelle, even though you're not in the picture now. I just have a small observation about the meta-ought question, the ought we be telling others what to do or think. So generally, on the one hand, I think no, we ought not be telling others what to do or what to think. However, I think that what we ought to be doing is sharing our well-formed answers to questions and our well-formed systems of thought that we've each developed and then there's a kind of understanding that each person, each discourse agent will allow their own system of thought to be influenced and affected by the others, and that ultimately, we're all going to get to the best place. Now, this is my other side, my other hand, in order to convey our well-formed systems of thought, our well-formed answers to questions most effectively, you kind of need to lean into it as if you're telling people what to do, as if you're, making a case for something in court. That tends to be the language that really gets the idea across. So if there's a way that we can perform as if we're doing an ought on people while we know that ultimately that's not really what we're doing, I think that's what works. So it's kind of like, you're leaning out into the abyss of being potentially arrogant, and there's a harness or a person holding you back, and that's your sense of humility. And so in the tension between those, I think, is where you find what you want. And regarding, my talk about braiding and modernism and postmodernism, it's just kind of funny that you brought that in, and because to correct you, in my work, I never tell people you ought to braid. I'm simply observing that in culture, that's a pattern that we see. But if I'm being honest, there is some sense in which I think people ought to do that more. So somehow just the tension between those things, I think, is vital. And then just to get really picky, in terms of the pattern that I observe, it's not a braiding or oscillation between modernism and postmodernism, each of them writ large. It's braiding between specific polarities that might be understood across the modern postmodern divide. And really the best way to think about it is just to take modern and postmodern out of the picture altogether. Those are just kind of stand-ins for what we're really trying to talk about. That's it.
Very well put. I appreciate that very much, and absolutely on the polarities point. And no, but that thing you just said, that was fantastic. And Alex, but wonderful to see you, sir. On that idea that you don't say you ought to braid post-modernity and modernity. You ought, but there's another way. In the same way that I don't want to say, there's this weird way in which I want to say and don't want to say people need to move from bad philosophy to good philosophy in the David Hume sense. Right. And the question is, when I look at myself, why is that? Because I like what Eba was just saying about, like, there's this performative ambiguity that seems very problematic, where you just kind of perform ambiguity, like that you don't know, because there's something about that is almost cheap versus costly in the in kind of, to use that Bonhoeffer distinction that I always like. So there's this way, like you're saying, is that you have to live it. You're showing it. Because there's a weird way as well, I think, that one of the reasons why, perhaps, because something we've been talking about, everyone, Michelle and I had a conversation on ought you do philosophy, because we're asking, when we tell people to philosophize their life, are we saying that they ought to do it? There's a weird way in which you are, but then at the same time, it also feels you're not. And you're kind of also in another way saying that people ought to live in such a way that they can determine what they ought to do. Right. And you're taking a kind of stand on that, right? Like a hard stand on, no, you really need to work. Like, I do think people assume that, and because I think they have ideas more than think ideas. Ergo, ideas kind of have them more, and I'll throw it to Satori here. That they basically assume that there's not pre-work that needs to be done to make a decision. They basically just think that they can make the decision, when actually, no, there's a whole lot of pre-work. Are you defining the terms correctly? Are you actually to terms with your nervous system, as Seth may say? Are you, like, what is the place? Are you in the place by which to make that discernment, right? And it's kind of interesting because there's all this thinking that has to be done, like tilling, almost tilling the ground. Like I was saying, we were getting the tomatoes done, right? And there's a weird way in which, yeah, you're taking a pretty hard stand on saying you ought to meet the conditions necessary to determine what you ought to do, right? But there's another weird way in which that's self-evident. So you don't need to assert it, right? How could you assert it? It doesn't really make any sense to assert it because it's almost it's a truism. It's just kind of given, right? That's where it does seem to be, it moves to showing. Like it moves to like actually showing what that is. And there is also, I suppose, something about, like you're saying, with conversations or modeling, where instead of asserting, I almost want to say you're making a form of art. I do think these conversations that you can see online that are recorded have a certain, if they're done well, there's a kind of art form. There's almost a art to them that's being done, a new kind of art form, because you're making a product that's recorded that people can see and observe and respond to. It's interesting to think of conversation as art form in a certain way that has a certain showing that's going on, and thus people can respond to it as they choose without you directly asserting anything. But that conversation only works if people in it are, I want to say, passionate and taking stands for something, right? But also, I guess one of the reasons there can be a wise, somewhat holding back to assert is because I think also you learn that asserting turns to turn people off or is not in the spirit of the very thing you're saying. Like that's also a kind of issue I find with, dare I say, good philosophy, is actually a certain moralization of philosophy actually is counter to the very spirit of the thing that you're doing, right? Because you're also, when you do that, you're kind of just leaving the person with a premise as opposed to something that they can participate in, some sort of space that they can enter and participate in. But that tension you described was outstanding, and that's exactly what I've been thinking about. But let me throw it to Satori here and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day. Mr. Satori, thank you for coming, sir.
It's wonderful to be here. So I was thinking back, now that you brought it back around to the kind of why advocate for doing philosophy, I guess you could say, I was thinking about that when you first mentioned it. And I think it's interesting. It's because it's really needed whenever it's in communication with different people is when it becomes most essential, because, you can have your own private philosophy about how you do something that you do by yourself, and it's not going to, bother anybody. But it's always, when it comes to interacting with others, that it comes into play. And the use of it is that it may help you communicate with somebody who thinks very differently. And it's just kind of thinking about how even within you, like as a person, you have to have different like modes of viewing things, because you have to have that that tension within yourself to stay in the middle of the road, I guess, to not fall in the ditch on either side, because I think there is that thing of where something is you just apprehend it, that kind of like obvious thing which speaks to us. And, there's a few that are probably obvious to everyone. Once you have the experience of not breathing for a little while, you find that it's obvious that breathing is it's a good practice to take part of. Same probably goes with food and water at different intervals, and all the most basic necessities. But then I think if you get into, maybe this is like kind of the McGilchrist thing of like the left brain, right brain thing, and you have the culture that reflects those values. And he's definitely talked about why like the left brain, the pure like rationality dominance, has a lot of problems, and almost seems to be I know he kind of puts it as like, oh, that one is important, it has to be in subservience to the other. But when in a cultural sense, you can get that like kind of vibes based thinking, the group think, things become very tribal when there's no picking things apart, no examining, like, why are we doing this? Should we stop doing this? And you feel that tension most strongly whenever a group comes into contact with somebody else, with another, because suddenly they are confronted with the fact that everything that seems obvious is not. So you have to have those things going within you. And then, I think obviously that connects to the kind of like, I like the meta modern term, and it is very much like braiding or oscillating between these modern and postmodern things, because you need some sort of structure to say, like, obviously, if everything's in flux, you can't do anything. So you just have to, at least hypothesize something as a starting point. But then you have to explore the different ways, the different ways that it goes. And I was even thinking about this just, I've been studying a lot of the Arthurian legends. And it's interesting because you'll have this kind of, in like theology and philosophy in the medieval period, there's definitely this kind of love of this coherent, internally consistent system, this medieval worldview, but then and that's very much like a rational thing, and it's based on the rationality of it. But then if you look at what happens with these stories, this is the place where the interpretive elements are coming along, and a lot of times they are. So this is the one I just been listening to is it's the first version of Lancelot, and basically it's like it's just the total. It's like it's basically all about like what is the image of a feminine desire, and it's basically like the first time somebody's really written this down. So what do? They just take the male version of like and invert everything and invert all the details. And when you invert all the details, like some of them were wrong, and so you've improved them, but then some other ones were right, and so that kind of gets worse. But then, and so it's a very strange story. It's absurd. It's very much anti-rational. He gets Guinevere is very upset with Lancelot because he takes 2 steps before making an irrational choice. That two seconds of thinking about even considering common sense is very offensive to the spirit of romance. And so it just goes in all these bizarre details. But then if you look how this story evolves over time, it's always becoming like more plausible. And so then you see like, what is why is Guinevere always falling for Lancelot? Why is he always, why would he betray Arthur? Like that's the big question, and the story gets more complex. It gets more realistic until it just kind of comes to a point of like, yeah, you can't, unless if you remove that critical element, which is the adulterous relationship, there's only like one possible way it's ever really going to end up, But it's interesting because it takes a couple centuries for those things to work through. So we've always been kind of doing this. We've always been going through, like these different negotiations of viewpoints. And I think now maybe like what Mr. Jockin was talking about with how everything is so like atomized. Like we've done so much. Like you can, if something hasn't been reduced down, you can do it now. But so now is the time where it's like, okay, it's time to start bringing synthesis back together and taking these things that they do work, maybe in functional parts, or something you have the gist of, and weaving those things together or braiding them together. And I think that it doesn't have to be in a concrete way, like this is the way that it is, but it's giving us these new maps that are we're forming them in a state of negotiation, which means it's very easy to communicate with other people who are also viewing their map in that state of negotiation, and then that's a really good place to be able to learn from each other. So,
no, very well put. Well, there's something about to that very point where, if I'm thinking about, Mr. Ebert has said that, philosophers love to problematize and create problems and just generate more and more problems, where there's one way in which one can hear that and say, oh, you're just being difficult. But there's another way in which the philosopher in doing that is actually, no, there are problems that you don't realize are a problem. So in problematizing, they're actually like becoming real. Right. So, for example, this can happen in marriages all the time. The husband doesn't think there's a problem, but there actually is a problem, and they actually need the problematization to realize the reality of the hermeneutical differences. Right. And actually, very often, where there's a lack of negotiation, a lack of the conversation, that's actually a problem that you will experience as not a problem because you know what to do. Right. But usually when you know what to do, you're in the realm of overfitting or power or dominance or controlling the narrative or so on and so forth. But if you problematize to realize the negotiation, then you have to have the kind of subjectivity that can handle it. And I think, as Mr. Jockin has pointed out, if one is not doing that for the beautiful, why would you do that, right? Because, hey, when you don't have the negotiation, it was good. I got whatever I wanted. It worked in my favor, right? So there's a way. And I think when you bring up literature, it makes me think of Owen Barfield, Hayden White, and all these different cats who really say, like Hayden White and Gadamer as well. And then I'll give it to Christian here, and if anyone has anything to say on really what they warned is, it's like, you really need, if you really want to understand history, you've got to study the art. You've got to study the paintings, because for Gadamer, that's the only way to get I think he calls it the horizon of the medieval mind, the horizon of the American Revolution, because that is going to more get at the kind of subjectivity, way of experiencing the world they had in the painting, in the art, right? And if you just study the facts, Hayden White, and I think Shelby Foote as well, but both of them warn that you end up with something like a chronology or a list of facts, which of course has value, but the problem is one can experience, if you read history as a list of facts and you say, I know the facts, therefore I know history. Therefore, I won't repeat the mistakes of history. And now you're extremely set up to repeat the mistakes of history because you haven't grasped how they experienced the world, of which led them into the mistakes of history, for example. Because no one ends up in the great mistakes of history saying, you know what I want to do? I want to end up in the great mistakes of history. Of course not. You have an experience of the world that for some reason makes you believe doing this is how you're not going to be like, because everyone has a history they don't want to repeat, right? Like 500 years ago, they were talking about not making the mistakes of history, right? And yet we keep doing it over and over and over again, because avoiding that is going to more be getting into trying to feel history, but not just learning history, but actually kind of feeling it. Unfortunately, ideas are not experiences, and we tend to learn from experiences, and it's hard to experience history because it's not here. And so the way to overcome that gap is to try to go into the arts of history. That gets you closer to experiencing it. And something you do see, and another thing that they would point out, is that you see a kind of negotiation of values, a unfolding of subjectivity, a negotiation of persons. And there is a sense where our age is one that is actually aware of that. And so now that negotiation is something that is moving more to each individual as opposed to on the macro. Like instead of playing out on the macro, it's more and more coming to the individual. And for the sociologist, that's the loss of givens. The loss of social mediating spaces is indeed when you enter into existentialism and thus negotiation, which is a real freedom. There's a real freedom in that because you're now free from the givens. But freedom is also terrifying, and you have to work through that. But again, there's a way in which, like, philosophy is basically saying that, yeah, you need to actually enter into the reality of that negotiation, that uncertainty, and work with it. And there's more to say, but I'll throw it to Christian here. Because if you do not, someone is paying the price. That's also a kind of claim. Like, if you're not questioning yourself, your spouse is paying the price, or your friends are paying the price, or your community is paying the price, right? Like, someone is being impacted by your inability to perhaps problematize your own understanding of the world, unless you just surround yourself with people like you. And that, of course, leads to, and well, there are many, that's a political option people are moving toward, right? And the question of global pluralism is, in fact, if there's another way for people to root themselves in that very sense. But I will pause and throw it to Christian. Christian, it is wonderful to see you, sir. I hope you've been doing well.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to keep it short because there's a fair amount of background noise, cars, stuff, traffic. But the words I was kind of orbiting around were the word should, um, the concept of observation, and I might try to work in thumos or thumos to put it. But then also the beautiful. I mean, it's someone, I don't know if it's you or Jockin, asked the question, what is the beautiful? Such a good question that I don't think anyone has the answer to. But if we can try, I'm still chewing on a quote from Pythagoras, or attributed to Pythagoras anyways, which is that on the topic of philosophy, life is like the great games, that some people go there to compete and some people go there to make money and the best people go there to observe. And interestingly, Pythagoras was the first person to call himself a philosopher in ancient Greece, and eschewed the title of what's the word? It means wise person. It's not sophist, but anyway. So, you can think about that quite a bit. I actually think it's a deeper comment than Socrates' I know that I do not know, in terms of like trying to get to a very succinct pointing at what is wisdom. And I think it's because it kind of indirectly is speaking to something about beauty. Why would it be good to observe? Right? And rather than engage in a competition of philosophical moralizing, or what I think it's better just called theorizing, if I can be pedantic about it, and really make an unpopular cleave between what we normally would call philosophy and call most of that theorizing, and then put philosophy solely on this very simple concept of loving wisdom, which can be expressed through theory, which can be expressed through tons of abstract concept, but which can also be expressed through observation. The idea that there's something of the love of wisdom in pure observation, I think, again, brings us to the question of beauty. In order to observe, we have to appreciate, we have to take in everything. We have to do it in a way that's somewhat holistic, or at least we are observing more deeply and more broadly when we are observing more holistically, rather than narrowing ourselves down, right? In order to compete, in order to make money, we have to kind of surrender some of our observational capacity, right? Now I am just observing my opponents. I'm just observing this contest. I'm just observing my bank account, whatever it is in this game that I'm playing. Whereas the observer is, wide angle, so to speak. And I think there's I'll try to end it here. There's a surrendering in this observation, a surrendering to beauty, because observing doesn't mean that what you're observing is something that you would necessarily agree with as ethical. So why are you observing when you could be injecting yourself into the situation and stopping it, right? And I say that as if those things are completely mutually exclusive. I don't think they actually are. But to speak to that question, I would say there's a way in which we are seeing the beautiful, even in that which we disagree with or which is offensive to us. And so how can we do that? How can we look at something that's offensive and say it's beautiful? This is maybe the kind of the classic spiritual dichotomy of the relative and the absolute. But the reason why I think it's at least wise to see the beauty in that which we disagree with is because we risk repeating, as you were saying, with like our like kind of historical blindness, right? No one goes into life thinking I'm going to make a big historical mistake. They're trying to do good, but our ability to do good, it correlates to our ability to observe, to keep as much of a good frame on what's happening in our situation as possible. It's hard to do that without appreciating, because then we use Buddhist terminology. If we can't see the beauty in something, we kind of will begin to reject it. We tune it out, so to speak. All right, it becomes we just we subtract it from our frame, or we shortly will after a brief amount of time. And when we do that, well, now we're not kind of playing with a full deck of cards. We are going to make decisions that don't account for the complete situation. We're not, for instance, looking at the deeper layers of psychological motivations that are informing our enemy's actions, right? We've forgotten about that. Now we're just like dealing at some superficial level and blah 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 blah. And that's exactly how you make the mistakes of history, right? You've kind of lost contact with some important aspect of reality. Hence, we need to constantly be in the mode of observation. Hence, we have to have a bigger capacity for seeing beauty in that which is, let's call it grotesque, right? There's something ugly about it, and we have an appreciation for it as part of something beautiful at a different, let's say, mode of appreciation. So to me that and I've said this many times, it kind of puts a task in front of us, in front of me, in front of someone, to figure out how to develop this capacity for appreciating or seeing the beauty in that which it is hard to see the beauty in. And not that everyone necessarily needs to do that to the same degree and have the same level of skillfulness in that regard. But at least some people are going to need to. And on the whole, the more that everyone, the more we can I can't believe I said I was going to be succinct. The more we can kind of raise the tide on everyone's ability to have that capacity, the better off we are. But I don't think that's always it's a hard sell, right? It's like, come to my workshop. I'm going to expose you to ugly stuff and then convince you that it's actually beautiful. It's not an easy sell, I don't think. And yet I think it might be exactly what needs to happen.
No, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And it was funny as you were saying observe there, and I'll throw it to Thomas, Jockin here, and Chetan. Absolutely wonderful to have you, sir. Thank you for coming. Completely wonderful, sir. Well, thank you for coming. And no, as you were saying on observe there, it is interesting, the double meaning, and Michelle and I were talking about this, where there's observing something and then observing it as in honoring it. Right? And what's very interesting is it seems actually very difficult to honor something in front of you, right? Like to honor its fullness, right? The map is not the territory, but how do you honor the territory when you're stuck in maps, right? Like how do you honor what is in front of you, right? And it seems to be very, very difficult. And it also just reminded me, I suppose, if this was the birth of a philosophical life, I don't know, but maybe I was like 6 or something, eating cereal on the carpet, the green carpet in the upstairs room, when I had this moment where I realized I would never see my face, never see it. Because if I looked in a mirror, that wasn't my face. That was just an image of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I will actually never see my face. And yet it's right here. That's so crazy. And for me, this was like a big moment because there's a way in which, I guess there's a way for me, there was something like, I'm not sure if I can see. There's something about philosophy that feels like, oh my goodness, adorable. I'm not sure if I can see, actually, right? Like, and there's something true about that. There's something really important about this, because the problem is, like, I'm not sure if I can see this situation in my marriage correctly. I'm not sure if I can see this situation happening correctly, right? There's a certain sort of doubt, but it's a doubt regarding how you observe, and that you may not be observing in a manner that fully honors it, right? And that how do you do the work to actually see? And then, of course, there's the pitfall, as Mr. Ebert was alluding to, and we've talked about, of saying, I'm not sure I can see, so I won't believe I see anything, or I won't try to see, or I won't take any stands or anything like that, right? What would it mean to actually be aware that I'm not sure if I can see what is in front of me as actually demanding courage? Because there's a way of saying, I'm not sure if I can see, and yet nevertheless I'll step into, thus courage, versus I'm not sure if I can see, therefore I'll avoid, right? And, we talk very often about courage. I think there's something about, like, because again, if I just go to a marital situation, like, you really want to have a situation where both people in the marriage actually have a certain skepticism of their ability to see the situation correctly, but not so much that they become passive, right? Like, this is the interesting dilemma. You can say, I'm not sure if I'm seeing this correctly, so I'll just do whatever he says, she says, whatever, right? That's very problematic. But then there's I'm not sure if I'm seeing this correctly, therefore I'm going to step into it. But it's interesting because you have to step toward the other person to help you see what you can't see, right? Like, one of the reasons why I think, like, I do all of you fine people I'm indebted to, because I'm not sure if I can see, and y'all help me see. Like, I need y'all to see. I can't see this world. It's like, I think I read these books, I think I know what they're saying and all this stuff, and actually I misread it for a really long time, or I'm stuck in a language game and don't even know it. Like, I get life is characterized by this difficulty of seeing, this difficulty observing, that requires you to put yourself in situations toward people, toward the other, that actually helps you develop the ability to see, because the other helps you to see, right? And so it's just very interesting, because I think also when we talk about seeing the beauty and everything in the grotesque, like, when two spouses are angry at one another, they can see one another as quote unquote grotesque, or I don't want to talk to that person, or I'm angry at that person, right? And there's something about quote unquote forgiveness that is the stepping toward, right? There's a certain stepping toward. Now, we have to go into all that, but there's something about the inability. Like, there's a question of, can we raise the average of what would it mean to raise the average of people's capacity to take a step toward, right? To say, I'm not sure if I can see, and yet I'll step toward it, precisely in order to enhance my ability to observe. Like, that stepping toward, in this sense, is the only way that observing moves to observing as honoring and taking seriously the reality that I'm not sure I can see. And I guess I also want to say, philosophy is, like, it's just simply, like, Michelle and I were talking about this last night, and then I'll throw it to Mr. Jockin here, is if I have two phrases, like, I say something like, I know, I know that, I don't know, capitalism is good or something, right? You would say, okay, but then if I were to say, I think capitalism is good, we tend to assert the thinking with being kind of wishy-washy and kind of less real than taking, like, a hard stand of saying, I believe, capitalism is best. But actually, the truth is, like, reality actually is that you only think that capitalism is best, right? That the map is not the territory. Like, I think is actually the reality. So there's a weird way in which uncertainty actually is reality, even though an uncertainty can feel like an avoidance of reality. So what would it mean to acknowledge and take a hard stand on the uncertainty of reality in a manner that actually is taking a stand, right? I think you do start getting into something like courage, because when you say, I only think, that's scary, because you're opening yourself up to something, and I'm going to step toward the other person to experience what that demands of me, right? So there's some sort of mean here between the truth that you only think that you don't know, and not using that to have a problematic ambiguity. And I think it's stepping toward the other that is part of it, or putting yourself in something, but that requires a certain subjectivity. Much more to be said, but I'll give it to Thomas Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
So I think this whole idea of the observation, that's really interesting. Like, so the essay, like the dignities and the mnemonic of the beautiful, like, one of the major premises about it is from Plato's Phaedrus, about what exactly is the strike of beauty. It's the strike of memory, that in this particular, you get the memory of the beautiful, right? So in this particular, you see the universal, right, at the form of beauty from that particularity. So which is a really interesting move because it means that observation is in play, but it also means recognizing is in play too, right? Which we usually think are two separate mental functions. But I think in the moment of surprise of the encounter, it's where the unity of those experiences come together, right? I think another aspect of that Daniel brought up with this notion of I think related to the friendship of philosophy. Like this friendship space allows, I use the language a lot of chryality, like meaning like chryality is a mode of basically difference but same, right? So a mirror image is when you're asymmetrical is a chryal image, or your hands, right? Another one that's very interesting is interiority. Exteriority is actually a chryal as well. I think I read some gender literature once about basically femininity and masculinity related to the gender organ is that, meaning basically the exteriority of the male versus interiority of the male in that sense of if it just basically you can do the mirror image in that direction, not necessarily left or right. Like what we do with our hands, like in terms of talking about left hand and right hand. But what I'm saying is that there's a similarity and difference, and chryality is one of the ways we talk about it. I think I like talking about it, and that's what friends do, because the whole point is we can see the same event, same phenomenon, or the same object, which is text, ideas, and then see them from completely different perspectives, right? Have personal accounts. I think the big note is, as opposed to, I think, unhealthy spaces where there's a kind of like contest of who has the right account, and now the game is a rhetorical game of dominance to defeat the opponent and to shut down their argument and get your claim in the door, and then get that be the one to be the persuasive one, versus saying, I actually don't know, or I have confidence, I have conviction in my account, but I'm committed to this, that I will get, I need the other. I need my fellow colleagues to think through this together, that even I disagree with them, there might be something I'm missing. Or at the very minimum, it will, instead of, what's the word? It's not complex, it's not complicated, it's complexity. Basically, that the tension can generate new nuance and depth in the account, right? I generally find that actually within apologetics of religion, especially, like that tension of contention of the claim, even that's the thing, even when there's irreconcilable differences, the tension of the claims will force the parties to have to articulate their definitions and terms and articulations much more clearly because of the tension being presented with each other. I find that these are the kind of elements of observation, of not just of the recollectional quality of discourse space, the coming to see together, because we see with ideas, and that's kind of, see, this is actually the kind of the major rubs I find in the human person, is that we rely on images to understand. We do, our cognition, all our cognition relies on images because the phantasms are images. They're not the actual thing, it's an image within the person. But yet some images actually give us real contact to reality, while others are just fantasies. Which one is it? It's not so clean cut with exactly what it is, which is one of the underlying anxieties of our epistemology and our ontology. Like everything's kind of running down. I really do think fundamentally we have this massive crisis anxiety. We don't trust the images because we can be duped by the images. And it's partly it's actually really reasonable. Like, for example, did you guys know, I listened to a lecture today. Did you guys know that apparently flowers, to elicit bumblebees to go fertilize them, have mimicked the scent pattern of pheromones of other bees. Yeah, it really is literally, it's a schematic dupe. So when a bumblebee passes by scent, like their scent of the pheromones of the plant is composite of the same schematic proportions as bumblebees. It's hilarious. So therefore, the plant is basically duping the bee to get in there and give him what it wants that helps the flower pollinate. Because the schematic pattern of the proportion of the cactus, and link later. I'm not an expert in this topic. I just saw that they show the demonstration. They show the literal graphs of the representation of the pheromone of the specific compounds, and they map 1-to-1. They're exactly 1-to-1. Their formal schematic image is the same. which this is the whole anxiety. Or there's other ones related to lack. Lack has almost always been represented as shadows. And then there's great pieces of art that talk about this. Like the shadow looks like a portrait, but it's actually a bunch of trash that happened to be assumed an arrangement that looks like the figure of the profile, but it's actually not the figure. So thus, again, another point of the schema. Like this is why form has so many distinctions in Greek. Schema is where all this anxiety comes from, because schema is an accidental association. It's just an assumption that of just gathering together. It doesn't have the natural bond of receptivity. Like that's why it's an important aspect of physis, of nature. Nature has this receptivity, like, and that's usually one of the ways you can distinguish it, but it's such a nuanced point. And quite frankly, again, if you just rely on the image of the schema, this is where all the problems show up. But yet, at the same time, I remember I think we had a discussion on the net a couple, like many years ago, about like a cup, right? The cup's a certain form, but then if you do certain things to the cup, it could get new functions out of it. Also can destroy the function, but it also can get new ones, for example. But that's because there's more than just the telos operation of the cup because of the schema. The schema has a larger participation. It has more receptivity because of that. It's really interesting. But I'm just drawing out like what is the anxiety of the image. And the beautiful is one of those aspects that we have to tether with this point, because it's all about how does the appearance get safeguarded into the reality of the essence. So that's basically what I find that's the question. And then if we try to solve this by logic, you're duped. You're done, because you're going to try to make an argument of oh God, my mind's blanking. It's the correspondence theory of truth, right? You can do correspondence theory of truth. The propositions correspond to the reality. That's why they're true. Then it's just the same as an image. So it's just the same argumentation. You're going to get duped. So I find that this is I think it also relates to the idea. Like I actually find, it's been a lot of talk of like basically like addictions like that, of like temperance, like kind of a push again of temperance to fight against degeneracy. Courage has not been emphasized a lot. And I think a lot of the discussion really shows the case that the other moral virtue of temperance plays just as much a role as temperance does, in my opinion, for exactly these points and what you all were talking about, Daniel and Christian. And I think especially, and I keep thinking the Umberto Eco line. I keep thinking about it. I know Dark Daniel got really into this too, because I totally agree with him. Like I agree, I'm very captivated by it. If you have it's a real test of that grotesqueness, of the true horror of despair, to know if you really are a disciple of the beautiful, is to answer the question, can you see the beauty of your beloved's burial? Devastating. It's so devastating. Because everything's screaming at you saying, no, this is horrendous. And actually it relates to, I think, a big no. A lot of people don't remember the burial. You really want to remember touching that dead body? Do you really want to remember how cold it felt? Do you want to remember that feeling when that first piece of dirt hit the grave? Nope. No, you don't. Most people do not want to feel that. They don't remember that. That's actually why, really, I think Daniel, you made that comment before about memory as a reward of virtue is absolutely true, because that's what trauma makes you forget. And it's forgetting of the beautiful is always the first thing. You always forget beauty. Whenever you turn away from virtue, you forget. And when you forget, you turned away from beauty, right? Because the purpose of virtue is for the sake of the beautiful. So I think about that a lot. And I think Christian's comment is actually around the money. Really, it is one of the measurements of where you are in your development of philosophy. I think in philosophical development, let alone personal development. It's not an easy test. It's not an easy question. I know individuals who, for example, one individual I know, their brother passed away very traumatically and tragically 10 years ago. Only now are they starting to think to approach. They haven't been to the gravesite. They have not been to the gravesite. They haven't even talked. They are not even willing to talk about it. That the degree of repression was extreme. But I'm very sympathetic. I understand. I say this because I went to my father's gravesite when I went last to visit, and absolutely, there was a part of me did not want to go. There was absolutely a part of me who did not want to go, because to have that reality of this body in the dirt, and to have that confirmed to you, that's a very tough take. It took courage. It took absolutely courage. There had to be a call of something more important. Something is more important. And I think that's generally what courage usually requires is to remember, and it's a memory. It recall like I double and triple down on memory because it's only in those moments of true tension where you have a choice to make. It's gonna be what is holding to your attention that's gonna decide everything in terms of like I've personally from personal experience I felt that way. Really, the really critical crisis moments of life where a real moral decision has to get made of virtue. If virtue is at play or not, is really a crisis of like you have to what gets in your mind of recalling, which is interesting because it's actually not just the thing in front of you; it's actually a memory. It's something behind, like with you or behind you. Who knows what to talk about? I'm kind of meandering a little bit around this, but I'm just saying about the play of the observation with the recollection, with the recognizing and the memory. I find all those play together in a very deep, rich way. I think observation is very important, just by the way, what Christian is saying, because like you cannot forget what's in front of you. You cannot forget what's in front of you. I think that's also the other aspect to it. So the forgetting aspect is almost like in two parts. It's almost forgetting what is your beloved, which this is kind of fun mode. Again, that's why I've been really thinking about this discussion of love, right? Very importantly, because I think the idea of love operating on this almost double move level. Like I got really into the Storge side in the essay because usually we talk about love in the eros side or the philia side, and those are very important. But Aristotle gives you a third mode as well, Storge. There's also agape, but that's a later development. That's not from Greek. That's not from Aristotle and Plato. That's a later development. But within Plato, within Aristotelian accounts, there's Storge, right? And the whole play of this. What is the other related to the self, the exteriority, the interiority? What is the nature of desire and how is receptivity? And kind of what is consummatory? What one takes a possession into? Think of Plato with Symposium with Diatemus speech. Is love the desire to the immoral possession of the good taking in? And then even in that line, Diatemus made a very important point. It's like, no, the eros is not for the beautiful. It's in the beautiful. I find that a really captivating image. The place of beauty, the place of love, actually, that whole point in Eros, there's the place of it within beauty, right? That's where the operation of the good occurs, the activity of the good. So then what is exactly the relationship of love to the beautiful? That's actually a question we get some answers to, but not necessarily, not explicitly, in my opinion, from Symposium and Diatemus speech, personally. And that's why I got very curious with this mode of Storge. The reason why I say that is because Storge had this, I'm bringing this up because Eros has this drive to reach out to exteriority and pull in and consume, pull in. And when you consume, there's an assimilational activity of removing difference to take into oneself, right? And the problem with that can be incredibly dangerous. This is also why, like, not only is it the anxiety of the image, there's also attached to it the anxiety of Eros, and with a thematic kind of consuming everything. But the problem is when we try to do that, when there's a reality of difference and we try to forget the difference, it causes destruction, it causes violence, it causes ruptures and things like that, because it's based on a falsehood. So what is the mode of love that observes difference? Like, that's the reason why I'm interested in that question. Storge seems to be the best option we have. The image used is the child to the mother. Something that's generative and coming to be, but yet also observes a clear difference between individuals, yet are in receptivity with one another. Anyways, I'm just riffing now at this point, so I'm going to stop.
No, magnificent, Greg. Wonderful to have you, sir. And no, it's very interesting because I'm now thinking about that love that wants to pull in. There is a way in which if you get in a fight with your spouse, you don't want to observe difference. You don't want them to be different, right? Like if you encounter a difference that makes you anxious, you don't want to observe difference, right? So you want to collapse the Storge. You want to lose it, right? You want to give it away. But then, as you were pointing out in your essay, if that is actually analogically the orientation toward the beautiful, like what the child has toward the mother, the general toward the army, et cetera, so forth, then if you get in that situation and you don't want to honor the difference, then you can't have access to that. So there's something about that moment when you encounter, and again, we've already talked about it, otherness, and I guess I'm thinking as well, please, Mr. Jockin, I'll give it to Mr. Satori here, because I am very interested. I'm always very interested in this weird posture that philosophy has, where it seems to and I would actually say it's I almost want to assert this is the ought move, the best orientation that a person has to otherness, right? It's this bothness of having a conviction, but also being open, taking a stand, but also being willing to change. That sounds impossible. If you're not willing, if you don't take a stand, you get it's this empty, cheap ambiguity or lack of position. But then if you take a position in a manner that is not open to otherness or not open to uncertainty, you're actually not realistic because you don't know, actually. And in fact, that difference could actually help you see something you cannot. So you have to have some kind of posture that is doing both of those things. And it does definitely seem to be tied to courage. And I know we emphasize that often. Mr. Ebert has said the meaning of life is courage, which I love that phrase. And we've talked very often with Chris and everyone on this idea of courage. But it is interesting to think, too, I stress this with courage here, because, Daniel was saying at the beginning, when you're reading a book, you have this experience of all these connections. Like you have these connections, you're reading Augustine, you connected with Aquinas, and you connected with all these things. And I would associate that, and Deleuze talks about connection, and I would associate that with a certain unleashing of analogical reasoning. And I would argue that that experience of connections and associations and notes and thinking things beyond the text actually is the state in which a person can come to love learning and actually want to learn, right? And that you're told not to do that in class. You're told to focus on the text, get at what don't chase your associations and connections, because that could just lead to, making a system like a conspiracy that has no relation to reality, and you're seeing connections that are not there, and it's very, very problematic, right? So following connections could lead to going astray, right? But this experience of connections, I think, is also something that creates the love of learning. So if you get rid of these connections, this feeling of following the connections, you actually are going to kill the love of learning. And I actually think the love of learning also teaches, the love of learning is how you also learn to love. Like if you're not able to love learning, then as your spouse or your friends change or they're different people, you're not going to enjoy it. You're going to feel like they betrayed you. You're not going to understand them. Like if you don't love learning, it's going to be hard to learn to love. Now I'd have to put meat on those bones and more has to be said, but it is very difficult to enjoy change and transformation unless you love learning. Like you will experience change as a threat if you don't love learning, and you're not going to want to change. You're going to want everyone to be the same, and that leads to tyranny and all sorts of problems, right? Now, of course, this definition of learning is more expansive than simply reading books, but this love of learning is very important, and it seems as if this thrill of connections is part of it. I want to say that following connections, because I would say conversations like this have a lot to, and thank you for being here, Daniel, although it's to Satori and then Chetan, this love of connections is also something that makes philosophical conversations like this enjoyable, because like, in this connection, you go in, you're following all these trails, and what's going to happen? We don't know. Let's see what happens. And so the question is, how do you have those connections not lead you into being like James Carey in that movie 23 or something? Like you see all these connections that aren't there. There's an A word for this. A guy wrote a Medium article about video games and conspiracies. It was grand. I got to remember the name of that. Lorenzo told me about that. But how do you avoid that, right? Or at least lower the probability of that problem? You do it in an act of, if we talk about the step forward, so there's the stepping, having a position, you're taking a stand, but not stepping forward toward the other, versus taking a step forward with a position while open to the other. I think basically following connections and analogical reasoning when you're without courage, without first taking the step, is where actually you're more likely to end up internal consistency, as opposed to actually in the encounter with the other myths, because the other kind of binds the connections, binds the association, binds the analogy. And actually now the love of learning then is not going to, it's less likely to take you off into madness, because it is actually bound by the presence of the other person who is going to respond in their analogical connections. And I think actually this is when analogical reasoning and connections can serve the girdle point, as we've talked about, as opposed to internally just creating internal consistency of systems and indestructible maps. But I will throw it to Mr. Satori and his beautiful son, and then give it to Chetan and anyone else on this fine day. Mr. Satori, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, that chasing that love of connections is obviously like, I think, I'll just go back. So what Christian was talking about before, about like finding the beauty in the person you don't like, or the thing that you the thing where it's the place where it's difficult to find beauty. And it brought to mind the verse in Ecclesiastes, he has made everything beautiful in its time. And I think there's really, you have to, there's something, I think, you get around the problem of images by going to something like a story or a song, or even like a biography, a person's life, where it has that, and it's a discrete thing because it's got a beginning and an end. So you can observe a whole, when you heard the whole song, then you can make some kind of judgment of it. If you hear a weird part in the middle, you don't know what it is, and something, sometimes it's like, it might take, you might need an incredible amount of context, like, to figure out what's going on, like Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. It takes, basically the chord resolves after 4.5 hours. You don't get the resolution, the literal music. He keeps the tension in the music until the very end of the opera, and then it's like, so it's like, it's like noise, tension, and then finally you get resolution. But I was thinking about this also, because thinking about like learning to appreciate the person that you don't like, and I kept looking at all the things of what's going on, what's wrong with where we are now. I keep tracing things back to Rousseau, and then I was just learning more about Rousseau, and really, like, he definitely had some of the very same, like, conditions or whatever that I have, and high sensitivities in a lot of ways and stuff. But then realizing, like, he had you start with like the books that he writes, and it's like these books are problematic, but then you have to ask, like, where did this come from? And you look at the life that he lived, and he was somewhat of a difficult person to get along with, but if you go back, far enough, and then you find out, like, things really started off when his mother died, like 9 days after he's born. So, and so now that's my big what if I get the time machine, I'll go back in time I feel like if you're going back to save a life, it has to be better than any of the possible ones where people go back in time to end somebody's life. So maybe we save his mother, who knows, then I don't know, maybe Jesus will already have returned. But but it's interesting, and this is what I think the thing, if you look at that and you look at these kind of discrete things and stories, and you're looking for that thing of courage, because then you can go into your own life, and even like a story like that, like Lancelot that I was talking about before, everything's either going to be going towards like a wedding or a funeral. It's a comedy or it's a tragedy, and you may not like. You may be saying, I hope this is a comedy, and maybe it's not. But if you really, but even in that, just accepting whatever it is, maybe you find yourself, you're in the tragedy and not the comedy. But the act of going through that does make it beautiful in its time. So like with Lancelot's first story, it starts off as like a thrilling romance. It's a comedy, essentially, whatever. It's a positive thing. And then people are saying, wait a minute, that doesn't, what about the husband? Sucks for King Arthur. And then, keeps going down. And then ultimately you find out that it's a tragedy. But it's beautiful once you know that it is a tragedy, because then it has its value. When you're not sure, it could be dangerous. That could be a problem. But once you find out this is a tragedy or this is a comedy, then you can really assess its beauty and its usefulness, and it can help you out. And, maybe and we all have those aspects in our own lives. And I think that's the courage, is to not stop worrying about, maybe that's where even to say, consider both sides. Maybe what I think is heading towards a comedy is heading towards a tragedy. And if that's just the way that it is, then if I can accept that and I can move forward with courage, maybe it's not fun for me necessarily, but it will bring beauty into the world in the effect that it has on those who observe it, those around me. So that's the way it goes.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and very well said. And yeah, I've always needed to, Rousseau and Hume were friends, and then they kind of broke it off in different things, and I've always wanted to kind of write on that and talk about it. I sometimes wonder if the tendency for people to, instead of like, it's funny how we talk about, oh, are you a Humean? Are you a Rousseauian? Are you a Hegelian? Or so on and so forth. And I sometimes wonder if like we would have different thinking if we were to talk about, I am of this milieu, I'm of this friendship, I'm of the friendship and the civilizational moment of Rousseau and Hume. I'm of that conversation and the way they bashed heads and what they broke over. I locate my thinking in the break between Rousseau and Hume. And I sometimes wonder if that would almost be more fruitful than just being a Hume scholar, or like, no, I'm going to be a scholar of the relationship between Rousseau and Hume and the break points and et cetera, so forth, or the relationship between Adam Smith and Hume. And that's what I'm going to study, right? It is very interesting how we don't tend to be specialists in relationships, say, between Hegel and Schelling and all of those cats. We tend to be specialists in one thinker, right? And perhaps there's a whole entirely new vista of thought to be found if people were to instead be, no, I'm gonna be a specialist in the relationship between Carl and Michel Planier, the brothers. I'm gonna be a specialist in that family, in that milieu, or I'm gonna be a specialist in how Virginia Woolf and Keynes talked, right? It would be very interesting to see what would come forth from that. You said a lot there that was very, very important. The thing I'll say as well that I was thinking about, and then I'll throw it to Chetan here, is I'm also, I guess, because, to speak of weaving kind of analogically, at least to Dember's work, it seems to me as if unless you take that step forward in courage, you can't weave things together. Like you can't, like there's a difference between stepping back and weaving them together. Let me put it this way. Usually if people don't step toward the other, they tend to build a case against. I'm going to build a case against why my wife is wrong. I'm going to build a case against why Marx is an idiot or whatever. But if you step toward them, then you start saying, we weave together. Oh, this is why she did what she did. This is why I thought this way. Oh, this is how it goes. Like in stepping toward the other, okay, I think Marx is an idiot, but let me step toward him. Oh, okay, I can see what he means by that. And he's responding to this and so on. And you start weaving, right? Like we're not able to weave in that way that Greg, he uses that terms unless we step forward, right? And basically as well, in an age that doesn't have givens, the ability to weave becomes extremely important because you don't have givens, right? So you have to create. But the problem is the question becomes if weaving is simply going to serve creating internally consistent systems, ergo maps as I describe it, or if it's going to be weaving the surprise that comes up in the encounter with otherness and actually weaving those things together, which is going to be following analogical reasoning in the way that Mr. Jockin was talking about. I have more notes, but I will throw it to Chetan here. Chetan, it is completely delightful to see you, sir. Thank you for being here. Goodness, it's a delight.
It's a pleasure, lovely to be here. Thank you for allowing me to come in. Actually,
of course.
Yeah, I've been hearing a conversation. It's a fascinating conversation, and I'm trying to collect my own thoughts on it. Maybe one can start by sort of bringing the unconscious as a problem into the picture within this thinking, and maybe sort of point something out. Unconscious doesn't allow this straight line between intention and action to be formed. If I think courage is important, or I'll not become courageous, or if I feel that there's something about a break that comes when you center the unconscious as a question. One way to maybe articulate that break is, say, the Bruce Fink's very famous work, Against Understanding. He argues that understanding is of the ego in that sense. In that sense, understanding gives you these stable, coherent narratives. And and generally ego sort of domesticates, and you need to see the breaking points or the splits or the the coherence of the structure to actually get to something else. And I think at that point we can start asking some kind of a problem from ourselves. The problem is of this nature. When we sort of encounter beauty, and Kant very nicely sort of theorized beauty as this free play between imagination and understanding that he was trying to sort of think about it, disinterested pleasure, in that sense. And one of the things that Nietzsche attacked Kant on was exactly that, no, beauty can't be free from desire. In that sense, beauty can't be free from the symbolic work in that sense. So you can't think of beauty simply in that sense of ideal freedom or ideal nature, as Kant was sort of trying to think about that question. And immediately we start seeing that there is something cutting these two discourses at this moment. One is this problem of desire, vis-a-vis the unconscious, because if you have an unconscious, you have desire. That's the nature of the problem, because desire is structured through lack, through the gap in that sense. And beauty as something which pertains to satisfaction of the desire. Right, and when you're bringing in this question of learning, that is what you are trying to sort of come out, that there is something about beauty that can satisfy desire without the object being consumed. Kant already had that instinct when he was saying that beauty is not about consumption, it's not about using, it's not about, but it still gives you some satisfaction. And Nietzsche says, no, you can consume it also, you can do everything with it also, and yet beauty exists over there. And both of them are actually concerned with this problem of satisfaction, that in the satisfaction of desire, if some kind of sublimation has to happen, and what you mean by learning over here, that a desire has to be satisfied in a different, it has to be elevated in some senses or something of that nature, or change its trajectories. You need this opening called beauty. I'm not saying beauty always works. Beauty can't be ugly. All of those things are possible. But the category beauty, at least at some level, opens desire for alternate courses. It opens the space for alternate forms of satisfactions, and it also opens up this cut of the unconscious for us in that sense. Understanding, and Kant regularly said it, if understanding dominates, you can't have beauty. Beauty only happens when there's a free play between understanding and imagination. If you're dominated by a concept, you can't have beauty. You will have this very stable structure, and beauty will always, in some senses, evade you. There's something about that problem that Kant I think, very nicely saw. If we take this, very sketchy structure that I just was writing down when you were talking, forward. We find some very interesting ways to move forward within this problem. Because one, I think beauty itself becomes a problem when we search for beauty in that sense. There is something about beauty which gets it in its own turmoil, because it can't it can't be forced in that sense. It has to be an opening. It cannot be a closure in itself in that sense. And in what context does beauty become something of that nature? And that is a whole discussion on art that has to sort of shape our thinking, within that context. The other, I think the interesting question of love that I think Jockin Thomas raised, which I'm extremely interested in, because love again has this interesting tension with desire in that sense. Again, you see this problem happening, that when you have too intense and desire can destroy love also, and can actually be the ultimate site of love also. And both these tensions sort of emerge there. And I'm not trying to answer the question. Thomas is right. It's a problem which needs its own speculation. But it's definitely something to think about, that if love is at its core, in some senses, bringing the libido outside the ego in that sense. If love, as Freud sort of saw on narcissism, if love has something to do with ego becoming, in some senses, this tension, that ego binds all libido. In that ego can only love itself, and if love is a point within that matrix, where ego can find this external, um, um, uh, notion, one can start asking the question that would this dimension of the ego in that sense necessarily demand an elevation of the libido in the sense of beauty that we were discussing earlier? Would it demand, would it actually ask us to actually investigate this question for yourself, that there is love cannot be accessed without some kind of sublimation. Without some kind of sublimation to be in placed over there. And what is the politics around it? How do we then start thinking about that question? I'm just sort of leaving it open, and I'll stop here. Yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. Now Reed is making his boat noises. You want to make your boat noises? Chetan is awesome. This is Mr. Paul. I said Reed. When you have kids, you realize why your parents always called you your brother's name. Because you just go through the list. You're like, Grace, no, Haven, no, but Reed, no, Paul. It's just like, why do I still do this? Why do I always, like, of all the names you start on, it's always the wrong one. Like, you could have started on the right, but you never do. And you're like, what? Why? Why is it integrated? Is this just the humility that reality entails? Or Mr. Paul? So I always do that. So right here, he has a tank top. Grace painted this. Do you see? She painted this for him. It's really magnificent. So it's fantastic. So his favorite place is the garage. Everything you said was absolutely magnificent. This gets at so much that's so important. So there is absolutely something about the strike of beauty that seems to be able to chart new courses of desire, and seems to be, in a certain sense, it seems to be, when you experience, it seems to be almost what, and this is a loaded claim that would have to be, it almost feels like, oh, this is what desire is for, actually, to experience this, because it can start to sublimate into drive, right? You're like, oh, we have a drive for beauty. But then if we make a distinction between the strike of beauty and coherence, when we seek beauty, we seek coherence, which actually keeps us from beauty. Oh, darn it. What are we supposed to do with this? Also interesting enough, what you were saying about a certain way that it's very important to bring in the unconscious, and a certain way it creates a kind of split in the subject, because like you have desire and it's kind of always throwing you off. But there's also something about beauty that has, dare I say, a kind of split in reality. It has this, so it's something fitting about it, right? That it kind of, in the way that Jockin was talking about with the mirrors, it's kind of fitting. There's a kind of fittingness that precisely the conscious, which of course is a loaded phrase, it seems fitting for beauty, right? And when you experience beauty, I will say personally, there's this simultaneous feeling of, when you get that strike of beauty, which surprises you. You can't summon it. Like, it just happens. And you're like, why did it happen? It simultaneously makes you go, yes, that's it. That's it. That's what I'm after, in a certain sense. And you also get a feeling of, I'm keeping myself from that. Like, I am actually, I actually am keeping myself from that, and it's gone. And you have all of these things at the same time, right? Like, there's this experience of, this is what desire is for. You are driven by this, and I'm getting in the way of this. And what do I do now? And I think this is extremely important, because it makes me think, we opened the conversation talking about this weird way in which it seems as if Michelle and I just had a talk about this way where philosophy seems, when we tell people to philosophize their life, because that's been a theme of season 2, are we telling people ought to philosophize their life? Because that's moralization. And that seems problematic, but then it also seems like, yeah, you really ought to philosophize your life, because you're a slave of your unconscious and don't know it. Like, if you don't think about it, you tend to be basically controlled. You're not free. Like, ideas have you more than you have ideas, right? So you ought to, and we also talked about how philosophy, almost as a kind of meta ought, seems to be in the business of basically saying, you ought to create the conditions so that you can determine what you ought to do. Like, you ought to create the conditions by which what ought to be done can be determined or arise on its own, right? But there's a weird way as well where that seems self-evident. Like, I don't need to, it's just like, why do you need philosophy? Of course. But the issue is, so then it's like philosophers don't want to tell you ought to do philosophy, because the reason is to create the conditions by which to determine ought, and that seems self-evident. So then, and then how do I even tell you that? It seems like I have to show you that, right? So there's this weird thing in philosophy where it's trying, in my opinion, it's trying to make, and this is just one thing that philosophy does, at least, it is about creating the conditions of discernment. It is not telling you what to discern, but it's saying these are the things you need for having the conditions of discernment, right? And life and so on and so forth. So if we're dealing with beauty, which seems to be central to what the subject needs, if you grant that, we're dealing with something that if we seek it, we don't get it. So does that mean it's random? Does that mean it's just random then, right? Well, what if there are conditions of possibility that can be designed or created that increase the probability of that beauty may occur? And that actually, not that it does occur, but that it may occur, right? Because that would therefore be the work that we should give ourselves over to, is if there is something about the experience of beauty that, and it has to be simply creating the stage for beauty in this sense, because if you seek it directly, it's just coherence. You say that's beautiful because it's a coherent painting, because it's symmetry and all of that, and Jockin has spoken very well about why that's problematic. And of course, I also have a paper in The Fate of Beauty. Like, what does it mean when we say a painting is beautiful? Like, if I say, oh, that's beautiful, it's like, what's the function of that as distinct from the strike of beauty in the way we talk about? It's almost like when somebody says that painting is beautiful, it's almost like they're saying that could cause the strike of beauty. That could be a condition of it occurring, right? Now, I have to go into that. But if you seek beauty, you actually kill it, right? Like, it's almost, well, similarly to love, like if I try to make you love me, if I try to force it, that doesn't go well, right? Like, I can't force it. And yet it also, and then I'll throw it right back to you, Chetan, but it also seems wrong to say that we can't do anything at all in any way by which love can occur in the other, or to be more lovable, or to actually bring about more love, right? So then the question is the ability to have courage, to step toward the other, to engage in philosophical dialogue, to follow threads, are all of these things actually creating the conditions of possibility by which beauty is more likely to might occur? Like, you're increasing the probability that something might occur, right? On its own terms, in its own way. And then the question is, if a person in the very act of creating those conditions actually kind of taste what beauty can do, even if beauty is not there. Like, you get a memory, and this is where I think memory plays a role, as Jockin has spoken on, because actually, as you're doing that work, you actually have the memory of the experience and knowing that these are actually creating those conditions. But then I think the trick is often the creating of those conditions can feel bad at the time. Like, you have to face your fears, or you have to have a hard conversation, or you have to do something difficult. Because I think one of the problems with the word beauty is when I say we have to make the conditions of possibility for beauty, people, I think, often hear that and say, oh, so you'll make a nice garden, you'll be friendly, you'll be nice, you'll do all these fun things. No. The conditions of possibility for beauty suck. They're like taking up your cross, or having hard conversations, or doing things you don't want to do. Developing virtue sucks. It's not fun. And part of the issue of why I think we confuse beauty and coherence is we associate doing the beautiful with doing nice things that we enjoy. Right? No, it's the work of fighting the unconscious in many respects. And the unconscious, like, the way you have to come to terms with your frenemy brain, and how what it's telling you to do is tricking you to save energy, and all these other things. Like, the creating of the conditions of possibility for beauty suck. And until like now I would say that in doing them and trusting in them, then you actually, in a sense, taste the joy that they can afford, but not necessarily, like, it's the dark night of the soul, all these other things become part of it, right? But more to be said, but let me throw it back to you, Chetan, please.
I just wanted to sort of add a couple of things. One is this question of symmetries. Of course, we know that beauty demands this a little excess. In the Object Petita, Zizek has this not a wonderful, it's a bad joke, but he has this joke of comparing two models. One is Cindy Crawford, somebody else, and which people choose, and they realize they choose the more imperfect one, because imperfection is actually what signifies or signals towards the perfection. In that sense, you can always see what is beautiful. You can look at these metaphors, like moon also has a black spot, and those kind of things, because you need the black spot to actually articulate what is beautiful in that sense. What is interesting about beauty actually is exactly, I think, this debate between Nietzsche and Kant, this question of whether beauty actually involves our being, or it makes us disinterested in ourselves. And I think both this tension is extremely important and interesting to chart and map, to think about this problem. Because if you look at love, love essentially in some ways is a problem, or which allows us to, or which is a magical thing at level 11, and a problem at the level and on another level, which also makes us overcome or at least become disinterested in ourselves to some degree. Love says that structure that without love, you would not have any reason to be interested in something else other than yourself. Eventually you would be playing your own game of ego. Love is what points towards the direction that we can be something else. We can be interested in something else other than ourselves. And one can argue, sort of looking from Freud, that even that is part of your own self in that sense. You have internalized that object and that whole story that he will go into. But even if you take that route, you still have to recognize that love allows this movement to take place. Without love, you would only be confined in your own images. And the word which Thomas brought in some senses. And the word image is extremely important and interesting to think here, because we identify, ego has to identify with an image for it to become an ego. It cannot become an ego. The stable structure of understanding comes from image. Understanding is essentially dependent upon image for its functioning. We don't realize it. We think it's all rationality and reason. No, it's not. Actually, there has to be a stable image to structure understanding. And how does that intersection with image and beauty takes place? Because beauty at some level can displace the image of the ego. It can give you some other image to sort of function with, to identify with. Which is why when you fall in love, you keep on looking at the person, you imagine her. You can play with image in a particular way. You see a beautiful painting, you see a beautiful movie, a beautiful novel. Beauty can allow you to sort of engage with different images than the ones, and it's an extremely interesting problem that I think emerges from there. Yeah.
Absolutely magnificent. I think what you're saying about this is a very big deal. I think the Jockin has spoken about, and I think it's true that very often people's notion of beauty is tied to Kant. It tends to be quite Kantian, and I do think we're missing Nietzsche and then Dante and all those other people I like to bring up. And Mr. Satori is expanding my medieval literature library, and so I have works to catch up on that I'm grateful for. But the thing that is coming to mind as you were speaking, then I'll give it to Mr. Satori, and then if anyone has any final things to say on this fine evening, we did get the tomatoes in the ground, so next is trying to fill up the raised beds, which I made too tall, so I need like 500. I have a whole lot of bags of compost over there. We'll see if it's close. So the person at Lowe's is like, "You like spending money here?" And I'm like, I'm just trying to grow some strawberries. So please. But what you are saying is, I think for me, the question of what happens in the experience of the beauty, of the beautiful, quote unquote, that creates this kind of, the ego goes away in a certain sense. The question is the following for me. Is the ego destroyed? Or is it, to use Mr. Ebert's language, is it kind of saturated, actually? Is it saturated to the point where it's too full to think about, actually? Like, so there's a way where you can deal with the problem of the ego that seeks understanding, that seeks a map at the expense of the girdle point, as I'll talk about, that seeks coherence at the expense, of course, all the different stuff we've talked about, because the ego is toward, because maps are images. Like reason has to create an image. It has to create an internally consistent system by which it organizes itself. The drive of rationality is, it has an aesthetic to it. There's an aesthetic to rationality. The problem is the aesthetic does not necessarily entail the beautiful. It can separate, and then it becomes problematic in different ways, right? So the issue is, the question becomes, is the ego, how do you deal with the ego, quote unquote? How do you sublimate it? And then, the sublimation to sublation, as Cadell will talk about. There is something about the beautiful that, in my opinion, is a saturation. There's a fullness of yourself that leads to self-forgetfulness. And this is why I'm obsessed with that category of self-forgetfulness, which people associate with flow and things like that. Timothy Keller has a wonderful book on self-forgetfulness, and he talks about Lewis and different things. We tend to think about selfish, selfless, and we get stuck between those two things forever. And I would actually argue much of ethical thought has been trapped, just oscillating between selfish and selfless, right? There's a third category. In the same way, there's negative freedom, positive freedom. There's, for me, freedom in, not just from and with, to, but freedom in, right? Self-forgetfulness is actually another relation to the self, where it's not that the self is destroyed or the self is honored. You just use it. and forget about it. In the same way, the way Lewis describes it is he says, when I use my thumb, I don't think about my thumb. If you're thinking about your thumb, you're not using it very well, right? You just use it, right? So for Keller, that's how the self is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the ego, etc. It's supposed to be like the thumb, where you just use it without thinking about it. But here's the problem, which makes me think about Ivan Illich. You know, for Illich, we got to get out of planning to preparing is the way I language it. But how do you do that without making a plan? Because if you plan to not use plans, you're in trouble. Like you can't, like the thing you need, you can't use, technological asset. You can't use the essence of construction or planning to deal with the shortcomings of planning or the technological essence and all that jazz, right? So what do you do? So it seems to be a problem. So in the same way, how do you engage in self-forgetfulness without that just being the ego choosing how you engage in self-forgetfulness? Therefore, it's egoic in disguise, right? Well, it has to be a self-forgetfulness that follows from surprise, that which just appears without you planning it, right? So it has to be the strike of beauty, something that just hits. And then in that, there's a saturation of the ego that leads to a self-forgetfulness, because if you spend if you have two people who are married, and the husband spends all their time saying, honey, I never think about you. All I think about is me. I'm crap. I'm trash. I don't even matter. That's not sexy. That's not good. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes the pianist that gets up there and plays bad in order to be humble. It's like, hey, I just want you to know, I don't want you to focus on me. So I'm going to play the piano really bad. Right. Nobody likes that. And yet there is also the tension of, what if a pianist gets up there and they do an amazing job? How does that then not serve the ego? Right? Well, the pianist, and likewise, if a husband or a wife does an amazing job, how does that then not serve the ego? Right? They have to do it in a way that leads to self-forgetfulness. It has to create a certain magnificence and beauty of quality where it saturates. You can't bring it to just being them. It becomes the whole. It becomes a gestalt, as maybe James Wiki would say. This is a wild condition. This is a wild quality. It is very difficult to articulate what we are saying or I am saying, but everybody knows it. Everyone knows it. Everyone's experienced it. Everyone has had that strike of beauty where the categories of selfish, selfless, ego, other, I, all of these things seem saturated. None of them quite capture it. You've had that strike of beauty and there it is. And then it's gone. And then you only have ideas by which to refer to it. And ideas are not experiences, and ideas are maps, not territories, right? So what would it mean? And then I'll give it to Mr. Satori. Everything you said was extremely important. What would it mean? And I think this is almost, this is kind of, in some respects, the task of our moment. What would it mean to be intentional about creating that experience? Like creating those environments? To say we're going to actually be intentional about doing that which seems to necessarily be that which you cannot intend. We're going to be intentional about what cannot be intended. That seems impossible. Well, we're in an age where doing the impossible is the only way to avoid all the game theory problems that are going to get us killed, right? I think the social coordination mechanism is a huge part of the technology. We have to think in terms of environments, design, space making, being kinds of subjects that can enter in to create qualities of experience, certain energetic experience. It is all about the full geometry, not just the algebra, not just the points. It's about the full way that one carries themselves in the world. That doesn't guarantee beauty, but increases the probability of its occurrence. And you knowing that, and knowing that it's fitting for you to live in such a way that increases the probability of its occurrence, thus brings with it a certain sort of fulfillment, a certain sort of fittedness, because you are toward that of which can possibly strike you and deal with all of these tensions that otherwise were just stuck between the categories, never knowing how to weave them together. We have to be intentional about the unintentional. And that's hard to think, but when it is done well, I think we know the experience quite well. Mr. Satori, I'll throw it to you, sir, and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine evening.
So I just keep thinking about that interplay between male and female, and kind of the thing that I've been studying. It's almost to think you could say that it's female desire that is pushing all of history forward in some sense, because it is this trade-off between images and narratives, or because narratives are what drives female desire. Men are much more captivated by images. Images are like models, or things that you can build, that you can look at, that's a stable thing. And you know, so it's interesting. So like, as I'm like looking at, even go back to like Lancelot 1.0, this is like the first attempt of like a woman who has the ability to commission a story to be written and says, what's my dream man going to look like? And, you know, he he is self-forgetful. I mean, he doesn't think about himself, but he's just, you know, he's just only whatever his mistress desires. That's all he wishes to do. And then, you know, it's like, you get this story, and then the women are like, huh, you know, now that I read it, that's not what I want. And so then but the thing is like, that was unknown. It was unimagined. Then it gets mapped, and then it becomes part of the mapped territory. And then you have to, they're always finding, what do women desire? Whatever this isn't, you know, they're looking around, and this ain't it. That's it. That's the thing. And so somebody's got to figure out to do something. And I think maybe even that is why, you know, the female tendency towards like these darker figures, it's like, if you see someone like Nietzsche, he didn't try to build a thing from the ground up. He's cutting stuff down. And I think that maybe that's the only thing that maybe in a more masculine sense you can do that is not static, you know, because you just start cutting stuff down, and then see what piles up, and then that'll inspire your plan. What can you build? And, you know, that's obviously there's better and worse ways to do that. You know, if it's war, that's bad. But if you go into the, you know, you arrive in the new frontier, and you just, you know, start cutting down trees or whatever, and find out what it's like, you know. So but I think, you know, it's always in that interplay, that dance between male and female, and like, you know, because it's actually, men are living that narrative thing when they're building a thing that will be stable. And then the problem is just then to not be content when it's done, and just, you know, want to quit or whatever. So, you know, and maybe that's, you know, the next version is somebody else's story, but you have to go through the steps. You can't just, you know, you can't just arrive. So, but the problem is that means that we always do have to be tearing down the things that we've already built, that we already love, that we think are beautiful. But if we don't tear them down, they turn into idols, and the women will leave because they get fed up. So, you know, but it, you know, I think it's just really interesting how the interplay between the sexes and those different things, you know, because it's almost as if like what we say, like the non-rational sense that pushes women forward is always connected to the territory. So in some sense, you know, that's, as long as they are able to do something, you know, they have some freedom, some voice, then if the men are building their indestructible maps, or it keeps them from being totally indestructible, essentially, you know, and that's probably, you know, that's a big part of the, you know, how many cultures are formed around containing women, you know, and seeing women as the problem. And those cultures do not progress very much. It's usually not very good to be a woman in one of those cultures. But I would say it's not really that good to be a man in most of those cultures either. So, you know, it's always figuring out how for the sexes to work together and those things. And I think especially even to go back to the beginning, you know, like, yeah, between husbands and wives, that's why the philosophical discussion is so important, because you're probably never going to just both be like, oh, well, we're both Nietzscheans through and through, or whatever, you know, like there's always going to be, you know, some difference, you know, the points of agreements and points of disagreements, and that's the tension that pushes things along.
No, I think there's a lot to that. Well, and again, of course, my bias, I always, Dante and Beatrice, right? Like Beatrice is pulling Dante along, but then also what's very important is that Beatrice is angry, frowning. If you get too close too quick, it will destroy you. Like it is not merely Beatrice, I'm going to follow the wonder. It's like, no, there's a certain, smack in the face that comes with Beatrice and a very, very real danger because indeed Beatrice is quote unquote representative of the territory. She is more connected with the territory. And in fact, it's very important that it ends with a certain incompleteness, the love that moves the sun and other stars, and it fails the lofty fantasy. I think, well, there's something about, to use the language that you were using, is that there's something about the male, quote unquote, and of course, these are generalities, so on and so forth, but the male is on the side of building the indestructible map. The problem is when the male builds the indestructible map to trap the woman in it, as opposed to building the map precisely to find the place where the girdle point is that the woman stands in, actually. Because that's the problem. Like a map, an internally consistent system, precisely the completion of the internal consistent system is either a choice of indestructibility, because now I never have to leave this, I have the perfect idol, dang it, or that very moment can be the revelation of the incompleteness. Right? And so what ends up happening is the male becomes extremely dysfunctional if they choose in that creating of the internal consistency to actually use the girdle point for indestructibility as opposed to actually acknowledging incompleteness that opens up, right? And that then makes the image turn into narrative, right? Or, as like the problem is there has to be beauty affords a new aesthetic. So you have beauty and it makes an image. But if you stop, it turns into, you got to keep moving. Almost like Deleuze talks about cinema frames. You have frames and they got to keep moving and then it's a moving image. Ergo, it goes more toward narrative, right? And so the problem is your brain is going to form an image. Like it just naturally does. It basically has to, right? Like in order to make intelligibility. Well, if it has to, then if you, here's the point. If you and I think it maps onto what you were saying with male and female. If you internally must make an image, then the creation of narrative must be external from you. Like you can't do it. You're going to converge on an image that you may call a narrative, but actually won't be. It will actually be an image in disguise, right? You may say my map is not the phrase, the map is not the territory. If it's just left to your devices will be a phrase that actually serves that your map is the territory. That incompleteness, that claim of incompleteness will actually serve completeness. Right? So are you screwed? Seems like you're screwed unless you can put yourself in environments relating to otherness. Unless you cannot be the source of the transition of image to narrative. This is why otherness is huge. This is why believing in the reality, this is why beauty has to have this strike quality. And this is why you need to put yourself in environments that are keeping you moving, right? And if we, like in this sense, the male has to continually relate to the female as what makes the movement occur. Right. And of course, in other ways, it's vice versa and so on. Right. Like, and if neither side steps toward the other, there is no possibility of the image turning into narrative, the frame of the cinema becoming cinema, of moving. Right. It will become an image. The very problem of image and narrative, then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. The very problem of image and narrative, to use that language, male and female, et cetera, so forth, is a testament that we alone, relating to ourselves, self-relating, cannot avoid the problem of idolatry. You cannot, yes, Chetan, thank you for being here, especially as late as it is, sir. Thank you for being here. It's really wonderful to see you again. And thank you, sir. Absolutely wonderful. And I'll throw it to Thomas. But it is inevitable without otherness. We end up in image, not narrative. We can't help it. It's inevitable we forget the girdle point. It's inevitable. Well, what do we do? Because then any intention, like if you say, well, I'm going to freaking intend not to do it. Well, that's just going to be absorbed into the effort of the internally consistent system. The very claim the map is not the territory will serve the friggin' map. How do you intend something that, if you intend, undermines the end that you're intending? You have to intend a space. You have to intend relationality. You have to intend an environment that can make you be surprised. You have to intend an orientation. Mr. Rivera had a piece on the importance of orientation. You have to intend an orientation to the other person that allows them to hit you, strike you in such a way that moves your image into narrative. And I suppose we can call this love. I suppose love is precisely the orientation to the other that makes it possible for the other to make your image narrative. And I suppose memory as well is a testament to the degree that you are the subject of which is open to otherness in a manner that it can move your image into otherness, move your map into girdle point, and so on and so forth. It would seem to me as love is present where image becomes narrative. Where love is not present, image does not become narrative. You just get image, right? Love is where idol becomes icon, right? And it is where image becomes narrative. And that is in a disposition to otherness, and that is in space making, right? And thought, and basically we have, in a sense, the problem is we have had thinking be what the brain does. We've had our brain be the house of thinking, right? Let me put it this way. We've had our brain be the house of thinking, and it's the source of thinking, and it's where our thinking comes from. But that means we're basically damned for the image, right? Instead, we need to say, no, I need my thinking to come from my environment. I need to put my thinking in my environment. I need to put my thinking, in a sense, in the other person. I need the other person to be what causes my thinking, not my brain. You have this question now. Is your brain going to be the source of your thinking, or the world, the other person, the encounter? Because when you encounter someone, you'll find yourself thinking thoughts without willing them. Like in conversations like this, how many thoughts have you had that you intended to have? Probably like none, or very few. They all just kind of appear, right? Well, yeah, that is thinking that has the possibility of moving from image to narrative, because they're coming in the encounter. They're emerging in the relation and the environment, right? Thinking that is isolated and more a product of willpower basically is damned to serve image, damned to serve narrative, right? So likewise, the male is going to build the internally consistent Tower of Babel if they don't have encounter with otherness. And I think also that encounter with otherness is how you get the cutting down, the deconstruction that is reconstructive. Because the other makes you realize you were wrong, but at the same time helps you feel like what you should think. That's the key. Otherness brings with it both a correction, but also direction. When we deconstruct ourselves, we get correction, but not direction, right? But when we get correction from other people in the spirit of love, in the right orientation, so on and so forth, then correction brings with it direction, right? And that's when deconstruction becomes reconstruction. But you can only do that when your thinking comes from the environment, comes from the other, versus from your brain out, right? And the problem is we're in the philosophical age of realizing we need something like deconstruction, but we only have an onto-epistemology, or an understanding of the person and the understanding of thinking, that it comes from the brain and willpower. Well, deconstruction under that sort of understanding of what humans are and where thinking comes from can never reconstruct. It must always, it's stuck in bad philosophy, as David Hume would say. It's stuck in undermining, of course, because the only way the deconstruction becomes reconstructing is if your thinking comes from otherness, if it comes from encounter, if it comes from surprise, if you just find yourself in thinking versus you find yourself in it and also able to own it in relation with others. Therefore, it does not become egoic in the way that Chetan was saying. And so this is the age of realizing that. And if we don't realize that, global pluralism is going to destroy us all. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, I was driving, so I could not reply earlier. I just parked, so you're again immaculate timing, Daniel. You know what? I'm going to close some loops from what was discussed. So, for example, Satori brought up one of my favorite Old Testament texts, the Ecclesiastes. Can't ever say that. So not only does he everything's beautiful in a time, but it goes on, that section goes on, if I remember correctly. That passage goes on to say, and he placed eternity in the hearts of man. So I think that whole point, the apprehension is found in the heart. That actually that has Aristotelian origin points. I say that because it is in the heart as moved by spirit. Aristotle has an account of spirit. It just never gets discussed because it's just so incredibly awkward from any Aristotelian scholarship perspective. People get very nervous about it, but it's there. And that part of the heart as the Lord of perception, and it's where the spirit works through, which creates is the activity of the soul to move through. And it is if that is the throne or the place of eternity, what that's implying is that when we are in a state, and now Dan, you made a comment, kind of a sublational like the sublation of the self, the strike of beauty is when, yes, when you're in a state of in the strike of beauty, it's not selfless or selfish. It's I use the language of self-forgetting or self-full. You're full of self. You're actually full of being in that moment because and that's the thing. Your ego becomes an instrument, which is supposed to be, because organ means instrument. That's the thing. Remember, in Greek, the word for instrument is the same as organ. They're the same. There is no distinction. There's distinctions about the particularity of a natural organ versus an instrument, which is based on the origin of activity. That's where the distinction comes from. But the actual word itself is the same in Greek. So it's the whole closing of my Plato course on beauty is the conclusion is, what is the purpose of the soul of man? Is to be the instrument of the beautiful. That's its purpose, to be the apprehension of the beautiful and to see by memory the recollection, to recall by memory the encounter of this particular of the beautiful. And I think, I'm sad Chetan left because it's very, I find it very encouraging, which Javier would call, to hear someone from a psychoanalysis point of view defending a position of the beautiful the way that he's talking about. I would agree with everything he's saying, and especially with relationship to love, most particularly. I think ultimately, and actually that's a big, see, the problem is most people in love actually don't actually love the actual person in front of them. They love an image. And actually, I'll stack a note of discernment when is the image a deception. I think this is where my essay about why I think I'm an minority opinion about this in scholarship, but that the idea versus eidos distinction is valid for this reason. It's only eidos is what gives us the living form of the bound of receptivity of union, right, of narrative, right, as we're talking through this way we're talking about with the logos. If we mean narrative by logos and kind of work that direction, then I run down this line perfectly right. Versus ideas are these artifacts of images that stamp on by their schema of forcing violence onto reality. And we know that's the case because when you desire another person or a thing for its abstractional symbolic value versus the reality of Michelle, you forget the lack, right? You're not treating the person as a partial object that can surprise you. Instead, you're treating this as an instrument of operational satisfaction, gratification, right? So that's one of the ways we can talk about the discernment about when are we in love and when is this infatuation or obsession. That's usually, I actually find that's a very important heuristic. You know, when you're speaking with children, and when teenagers and young adults and children, like when to know when they're actually in love, when is it just infatuation, obsession? This is one of those question marks. I think it's one of the ways you can discern that question. With this line of thought. I think that's very useful. So I think these points, and especially Daniel, I think also that note of the scholarship of the receptivity of the friendship discourse is another angle about this. So even I actually see my research and work is very much in that relationship, because I'm not interested in Plato. I'm not interested in Aristotle. I'm interested in the discourse of the two together. That's what I'm interested in. And there's contentions and there's some areas where there's awkwardness because they use the same term in inverse meanings at certain areas, and there's some cosmology issues, but there's areas of agreement. And you get a better picture by working with them together in disagreements and in their play with each other. So I think these are the takeaways I'm picking up from this conversation, but I think especially at the kind of closing the loop is the eternity that beauty connects you to is found in the heart, which drives the apprehension of reminders of the beautiful of this particular thing in front of you. And the motion of, yes, we use images in both, but the distinction of the ideas versus the eidos comes down to lack. Can we sit in the difference of particularity in front of us to be surprised by it and add that basically the stroge receptivity to participation versus erotic, that kind of eros capture, taking in and consuming and spitting out the difference, basically, right, to summarize this. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely magnificent. I've enjoyed it immensely. I'll close for dinner here, but thank you for being here, Mr. Jockin, Mr. Satori, Christian, everyone else who was here. Everything you said there is extremely important. Also, I do think scholarship needs to go in the direction of being a quote-unquote specialist of a relation, like between Plato and Aristotle, not just of Aristotle or Plato. I think that that will be, I think there's a lot for that. More to be said. I do also personally think there is, and it's my bias, but I think it's certainly there. I think there is absolutely space in psychoanalysis for beauty as we understand it and as we discuss it. I do think beauty is tied to the million-dollar question of how to create drive societies, how to move desire to drive, which is, for me, intrinsic motivation. And of course, different languages mean different things. Problem with intrinsic motivation is the phrase suggests there's a clear distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic when it's more complicated. Nevertheless, the term intrinsic motivation is one that has been in the society that for me relates to drive and the entire issue. And then my giant claim is many of our pathologies in capitalism is because we are still defining the person as the rational animal as opposed to the psychoanalytical subject. And basically capitalism must move from a desire-based economy to a drive-based economy. If it does not, stagnation and all the other pathologies will continue to fall into the system. And so those things are all very related for me. Also, if AI, so we've been talking about space making and design, as we often talk about, if AI is going to do all the tasks for us, then our job will be to make the spaces of the beautiful, as we're describing. Like, there's a way in which most human beings on this planet have jobs of tasks. We need to start thinking about jobs of spaces and encounters and things like that, right? It's like to actually think about spaces as becoming primary, like tasks in the economy. That kind of job and actually how to make qualities come out will become very primary for human beings. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, there won't be tasks, but they'll be in service more of these spaces. On that point as well, I just want to say what you were saying about the ego as an instrument for music, for the beautiful, 1000%. The ego, the function of the ego is precisely for the possibility of the apprehension of the beautiful in which it is the instrument of the beautiful and the experience of the beautiful. Yeah, it feels like music. It feels like harmony. It feels like things flow. It has this harmonious structure. The last thing that I will say is to, and again, thank you all for being here. So for me, what all of this is pointing to, to turn to the socioeconomic, is that, people will talk about capitalism, right? And yes, please, we need that to happen, Christian. Absolutely. Please email. We need to arrange that. I would love that. In the way that, there's this idea of capitalism, and Alexander Bard and others will talk about capitalism is now attentionalism. And Samuel Barnes also has a new book on attention, where he actually argues attention is more primary than money. Many people will ask, how does the algorithm getting attention make money? And the point that he has stressed, and I think Bard may agree with it, is that you're thinking about it wrong. Attention is more valuable than money. So they're not really concerned about getting money. They're concerned about getting attention, of which is actually closer to value as a fundamental principle than money, of which more represents value. And of course, that has to be expanded on. So there's this idea that attentionalism is more fundamental. Now, of course, that has to be expanded on. But there's this idea that capitalism today has become attentionalism. What for me this conversation suggests, and many of the conversations we've had, and I know you've all heard me talk about encounterology. There's a way in which what I want to say is that attentionalism must become encounterism. And encounterology is the study of how to do that. An economy that is actually based primarily on the encounter, because the problem with attentionalism is that it is still egoic. It is attentionalism in service of the ego. The sublation of that would be attention activated in the encounter, of which is fundamentally relational and has an entirely different metaphysics, or it affords an entirely different horizon of experience. Encounterism would be, for me, the negation sublation of attentionalism that entails attention and awareness in the Simone Weil Milgergrist Illich sense that seems to be more important. But it's attention in service, not getting attention to look at your Substack to get the attention of the audience, but it's attention to attend the other. And that is more of encounterism. And I've just, sometimes it's always, you don't want to keep making words. Encounterism, I've just said encounterology, but, if you want to make it line up with capitalism, attentionalism, you'll say encounterism, that's fine. And encounterology is the study of what would make possible that socioeconomic system. And I would say the social coordination mechanism is completely necessary for the sublation of potentialism into encounterism. The study, the metaphysical work that you have been doing in your unbelievable Substack, Mr. Jockin, would all be part, for me, of giving an understanding of the human condition, of which would give you reason to believe encounterism is more fitting for the human being than attentionalism, even if attention is part of encounterism. The work that Christian has been doing to make conversations happen on websites with those ads, all of those are moving the system in the direction of encounterism. And encounterology is the study in sociology, economics, metaphysics, etc., so forth, that would give us reason to believe encounterism would be the proper socioeconomic system. And of course, encounterism is going to move thinking from an emphasis on tasks and jobs to things like design and space making and relationality and qualities of personality and friendship. Encounterism is going to suggest that the fullness of economics is realized in that. And that is also encounterism is precisely how to have Skole, as Johannes will talk about and we've talked about, how to have Skole in the encounter of global pluralism, as opposed to isolated with people like you. How to have a different experience of time, the fullness of time, Kairos time, precisely when you're encountering difference, because you're able to harmonize with the difference in the Scroje way that Mr. Jockin has been talking about. Encounterism would be actually becoming the kind of subject who can realize that in light of difference, not away from difference. I think developing that art form, developing that way of life, developing those habits, developing all of that is the name of the business of the socioeconomic system now. And so doing creates the conditions of possibility that increase the likelihood of the strike of beauty and apprehension by which we can thus participate in the beautiful. Thank you all for being here on this fine day. I've enjoyed it immensely, and all the best to you. Thank you. All the best.